Hello and welcome to DF Direct number 201, our weekly show where we talk about the latest and greatest in gaming and technology news. Now, a lot of people are sick at DF recently, so I'm joined by a more eclectic panel than usual, and the first guest I'd like to introduce is the usual member here, Oliver McKenzie. How you doing there, Oliver?
Yes, it's the Digital Foundry skeleton crew. After a less than eventful episode 200, but a very exciting milestone of an episode 200, we soldier on here today.
Yeah. And a rare Pokemon for this, Tom Morgan. How you doing there, Tom?
Very good, Alex. Yeah, good to be back after actually a little holiday post-Christmas. I worked kind of over the Christmas break, and I missed that 200th anniversary for the Direct. I was gutted to miss it, but I did enjoy the episode and just couldn't wait to kind of get back on. So here I am.
Yeah, it was a fun episode. Maybe for the future 250 or 300, we'll do something a little bit more festive, but it was still good. But anyways, let's go on to the news. All right, first order of business this week is the Sony State of Play. We're just the day here after there, the morning after the night, as Rich would always say. And this was an interesting State of Play in that it showed primarily things from the third party, a lot less first party stuff than we would usually see from Sony, but still a good chunk of stuff to talk about there. And the first thing that we wanted to talk about from the State of Play was a game that seems to be causing a lot of buzz because it's a newcomer, and that is Tides of Annihilation. So, Tom, what are your thoughts on Tides of Annihilation?
I think there were a lot of games kind of on the show which were, there was a lot going on, lots of titles kind of being thrown at us, and it's hard to keep track of all these new IPs, right? But this one stood out to me especially because it's got this, it's captured on PS5 Pro very transparently at the start. It says in the captions, which is always a plus to see. Interestingly, there's an Xbox trailer which uses the exact same gameplay on the Xbox YouTube channel, but removes that caption. So, there we go. It's Unreal Engine 5, which I think we'll see is a recurring theme across most of the titles being shown at this event. And yeah, it's a debut release as well for Eclipse Glow Games, a Shanghai-based studio. And yeah, it's multi-platform, of course. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's there was a later, a longer gameplay trailer, which actually gave us a bit more detail on the kind of the nuts and bolts of the gameplay. It's kind of this Devil May Cry style. Inevitably there's a bit of a Souls influence, but I'd argue that Devil May Cry always had a bit of a Soulsy like look and style to it, with the action combat. But we got a good look at long stretches of gameplay, beautiful environments, some incredible like large scale bosses, almost God of War-esque. There was a lot going on in terms of the hair and cloth in the game, and there's this sort of combat system with two knights that you can summon with different elemental attacks, ice and fire. So that's the sort of setting. Then in terms of the tech, this is gunning for 60 FPS, as you'd hope for a kind of DMC style game. And it's also interesting to see that, on the PlayStation blog, they go into a little bit of detail, just a smidge, to say that there's a enhanced mode on PS5 Pro, which is being developed exclusively for PS5 Pro players. And with that GPU power, there's PSSR, there's higher resolution, ray tracing, improved image fidelity, and smoother 60 FPS gameplay. So yeah, there's something on show here for PS5 Pro users, and in testing it, kind of based on the footage we've got, it's you definitely go a good lock at 60 most of the time, but there were a few drops, I guess, that were quite easy to notice, even without frame rate tools. I think I don't know if you spotted it.
It was pretty obvious.
Yeah. But yeah, there's. I think it's especially in the boss battle with all the flying projectiles, you can really see dips there. But hey, it's the release date is is
not
not
even
on the
there.
cards.
This looks like a 2026 title to me. Yeah.
So I guess the last little point I wanted to add on this is the kind of native resolution side. And I think you, Alex, had a look at this with me, and we found some weird results in there. It was like native 1080p, but then some shots, like as we kind of walk around this giant like structure, this giant moving creature, it drops to 576p. And so I have no idea what that's about. It was like a completely baffling, what on earth is this sort of moment. So we'll be able to read more into that when it comes out, obviously, but 1080p seems like what they're gunning for.
I mean, with using Unreal, it's a notoriously GPU heavy engine, and especially if this is using any of the things that they mentioned on the blog, like ray tracing, it dipping below 1080p wouldn't be actually so surprising. I think we've seen that in a number of titles already, even on PlayStation 5 Pro. And, this is also still heavily work in progress. That disclaimer should always be kept up. But one thing that I thought was a little bit that I didn't like about this trailer is that it does say it's running on PlayStation 5 Pro, but there was a really big discrepancy between the gameplay sections and the cinematic sections in terms of pure resolution. And I think that was obvious just from the user perspective of watching this trailer. Like, the cinematics looked incredibly good, while the gameplay looked a lot blurrier and dithered and aliased. So they say it's running on PlayStation 5 Pro for this trailer, but I honestly almost doubt it for those cinematic sections. I couldn't possibly believe that. Looking at the game's technology itself, they say it is using Unreal, and they do mention ray tracing in the blog, but I'm not exactly sure what we are looking here at with this trailer, because even with Unreal Engine 5 Lumen engaged, which this could potentially be using, I really don't have any great evidence of it from this trailer. There's a lot of sections where you could see that a lot of the reflections were driven purely by screen space reflections. There's the boss battle where in this like pool, and there's all these archways with like really bright skylighting behind them. Yeah. And all that is all, every single time it's obscured, it just disappears completely. Whereas with Lumen, yes, there's a ton of screen space elements to it, but behind those screen space reflections is at least some facsimile of a more true reflection using Lumen, even in software mode. So I'm not exactly sure what we were looking at here, but I did think the cutscene quality was really high. Dialogue, not to my taste, but that is a whole other question. I guess, the only critique then we'll have probably about a lot of the other things at the show is that this was a third-person action game, and there was a lot of them at the show. So after the entire show was done, it was hard to exactly place what I saw. But this one was probably the most standout one to me from a visual perspective. I actually thought this was one of the better games visually at the show.
Yeah, I mean, I'd completely agree with Alex's comments, and I'd echo his remarks there. I think it looks great. I think it's one of the better looking games at the show, but I also think this crop of games at this particular show was not maybe of the highest graphical quality always necessarily in every single respect here. Especially, in those cutscenes, they do look incredible, like Alex mentioned. Often in UE, you do have incredible looking cutscenes, right? But then there's the gameplay in there. It doesn't look as good. I noticed the issues with the Lumen reflections that you mentioned. It could be using Lumen GI. Hard to say, I guess, at this point. But yeah, there are some discontinuities in the reflections, and that's a little bit disappointing. And then performance is all over the place, but it seems a little preemptive to make some judgment on performance, given that this is maybe over a year out from release, potentially, in all likelihood, given they aren't specifying a date. That probably means it's not 2025. But I mean, I like what's here in terms of the art direction. I think they seem to be using Unreal in a pretty competent manner. I like the animation. I like the fighting. I like a lot of things here. Frame rate isn't perfect. Some visual issues here and there, but I'm generally happy with it. Again, it's like another Unreal Engine game, and you can kind of spot them from a mile away. They all look, generally, if they're produced by a big enough team, they all tend to look pretty good. Artists have a lot of tools within the engine to make scenes look good, so it just kind of is what it is at this point.
Yeah, but I think that's all we have to say about this title. Let's move on to the next. Okay, so for this one, MindsEye. Now I put this one on the list because, and this is actually not a positive thing. I'm sorry if you're watching this, and MindsEye was your favorite game of the state of play, but for me, this was almost kind of representative of the kind of games that were being shown in some aspect, where it was a title being developed by a kind of smaller company that I actually hadn't heard of before, but it's an association with IOI, or however you say that, the studio that is responsible for the very successful Hitman series of games. And when I saw that, I initially thought, oh, it's going to be the Hitman engine. And no, it is not. If you look at it, it looks actually very much so like an Unreal game. I don't think they said that, though, explicitly in the trailer. But it looked very, very Unreal. And unfortunately, to me, this almost looked a bit like a fake game trailer. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I would love to hear your all opinion about this afterward. But like when they initially start the trailer off with that slide into cover behind a car, I was reminded of like the trailer for, I think it's called 8 Days. Does anyone remember this game?
I remember 8 Days, yeah.
Yeah, PlayStation 3 mooted launch title that never came out, then went to development hell. If you go back and watch that trailer, which is fake as all get out, there's a lot of similarities to this one about like driving cars through this open worldish looking environment and like big explosions and kind of just like a walking third person character model in front of the screen. And a lot of this, like here, like I kind of get what they're going for, like semi-destructive environments, shooting gameplay, but other than the explosions themselves, like the gun and the way the character's shooting the gun almost looked unfinished. It really did not do much of anything for me. And I visually, unfortunately, even though I don't think they said Unreal Engine, like I could just like immediately like see the stock Unreal Engine-ness of it while watching it. I know this is not exactly a super positive thing to say, but with a number of other trailers that we saw here today, like the overall stock Unreal Engine lookingness of them was somewhat of a detriment, especially after they were arrayed all right next to each other. And this one I felt like was like the worst example of it almost. But Oliver, what's your take on this title?
I think
here?
It's definitely the worst offender in terms of like this generic gludge of Unreal Engine titles, because it definitely doesn't look that great. The gameplay in particular looks a little bit rough, just like the car physics and the way the animation, the gunplay, it all comes together, and the graphics. It's just really not up there. You can tell it's really not up there with like that kind of AAA standard for animation systems and games, for just like the graphical conventions of these kinds of titles. I'm definitely perfectly fine with lower budget games, but the scope here is maybe a little bit larger. I think that's the issue. They're going for a big action game scope, maybe even like some larger areas, some driving sections, things like that. And I just don't really think they have the production budget maybe to pull it off. That's at least what I think, judging from this footage. And just not that enticing, certainly relative to some other games here, but it's also just kind of emblematic of some Unreal Engine-ness that we saw at this showcase.
Tom?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it says, again, captured on PS5 Pro. This is one of the handful, and it doesn't really sell it as a PS5 Pro title. Like, it looked very distinctly last gen, which is, this is only a current gen release and PC. So, and it's coming out apparently this summer. Like, that's where it's slated. So I'm not sure really what's... Yeah, I'm just like you. I mean, I saw a lot of explosions, a lot of, over-the-shoulder shooting in very kind of bland areas. I think the idea is that it's set in this like fictional desert metropolis in like the near future city called Red Rock, but it just didn't have any personality. It felt a little bit like, maybe a fusion of Watch Dogs, but even less personality than that. And
oh boy, less personality than an Ubisoft game. That's a rough appraisal.
Yeah,
I think it just it reminded me a little bit of Just Cause 3, but then minus the physics destruction.
Yeah.
It wasn't on show anyway. It might have some, but it just didn't have any of that. Had a lot of just lots of cuts in the edit that they put out in the trailer, which ended in a big explosion, and there wasn't really any interaction from that, so it just felt a bit static. The pro footage was running at about 1440p to 1584p, and there were drops galore, like under 60. Most of it was running at 60, but then there'd be just big drops under during any of the many, big explosions. So it's that's kind of where it is in terms of the footage we're seeing anyway.
Yeah. One thing to point out for the audience, we'll be talking a number of games about the state of play. And if we do mention resolution figures, one thing is that, of course, the feeds of these games on YouTube are heavily compressed. But if the file is at least standard output resolution of the console, like 4K 60, then we can get a lot better information on it using our tools about frame rate, because we have like compression threshold abilities to control there and actually still get a good idea of frame rate, as well as with resolution. Even if there's a ton of macro blocking in a footage, usually very bright edges that are caught can show aliasing. And those still allow the footage to get pixel counts, essentially. And so when we do ever talk about resolution, that's how you know. And in the case of a title like this, if it was native resolution 1440p or slightly higher, targeting 60 FPS, that'd be pretty high resolution for a modern Unreal Engine title, actually.
Yep.
That wouldn't be too bad, but also at the same time, I think you can see a number of reasons why that might be the case. But we'll have to see when this game comes out if we do end up covering it. There's all of a sudden, as a result of this showcase, now we actually have a lot more on the slate for 2025, which is actually a pretty good thing. This next title is one that's been rumored for quite some time now, one that we couldn't believe, but here it is in the flesh, and this is Days Gone Remastered for PlayStation 5 and I guess PC to a degree. So Oliver, take it away.
Yes, I'm very curious about this one. It's developed by Sony Bend, but it's being released after kind of the infamous reported squashing of any plans for Days Gone 2. They had a pitch, and apparently that pitch was not accepted. But maybe this could change that. Who knows? But it definitely does seem a little bit weird to remaster a game while not having plans for a sequel, a very popular game as well. So that certainly seems curious, but maybe that could change at some point. But for me, I think this hit a lot of the same notes as a title like The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, where it seems fairly similar to that original work. They did add some content here, though, like they've added a new mode, a horde mode type of thing. The Last of Us Part 2, of course, had no return, which is like a roguelite PvE thing that's a little bit similar. But on the technical front here, they're talking about PS5 Pro enhancements and VRR support primarily as the like main visual advances here, which is presumably some kind of unlocked FPS toggle or mode for this title, which is really common in Sony games. It does run at 60 FPS and presumably at high resolutions here, but the PS4 version already runs at 4K 60 using CBR on PS5 and has since the console launched. So I really have no complaints about that version. I think it still looks great. In 2019, I thought it was a terrific looking game. I still think in 2025, it looks like a terrific looking game. But they have mentioned a few apparent improvements here on the PlayStation blog. They talked about increased foliage draw distance, improved shadow quality, and improved lighting quality. So my kind of thinking is that maybe they're bringing over some of those settings from PC here. I think they had SSGI on PC. I think they had a couple.
Yeah, they did, right?
Yeah, they had a couple of visual toggles in there that maybe enhanced shadow resolution, pushed out draw distances. They're also talking about potentially a graphics mode and a performance mode. So to me, that's a little bit curious. It seems a little bit superfluous, given that the game already looked great with CBR on PS5 at 60 FPS. A pretty decent 4K-like image there with some artifacts, but it looked pretty good. So I'm hoping whatever they do here, especially on Pro, is better than that in a stable 60. And if they do go for PSSR, which is a very common trend among developers, especially Sony first-party developers, as we'll possibly be discussing later in the show, I think that they should make sure that it is like consistently above the image solution that they have on base PS5, and certainly above that 4K CBR solution they had on the PS4 code on PS5, because you really wouldn't want to see a regression at all relative to what you had, at the launch of the PS5.
Yeah, looking at this trailer, I mean, I think you could probably stack it up against, based upon the shots that they had, and you could see very clearly. I'd imagine if you stacked it up against that backwards compatibility version, you'd see exactly what the differences are. And based on everything here, it just seems like almost like a port of what they did on PC and bringing it back to the PlayStation 5. And I think that's totally viable. I'm happy that more people are going to talk about this game. I think it, at least in terms, I thought it was very negatively received at launch, and I thought it was better than that, actually. And I also thought visually, next to like Gears of War 4 and 5, this is probably one of the best looking Unreal Engine 4 games that was released for that generation of consoles. Like, way up there, and they pushed a lot. I think it was really interesting to see how much they pushed screen space shadows at the time in a way that wasn't always breaking. They relied heavily on it, but it still looked good. And I think the art assets as well too were always really excellent. It wouldn't like next to other 60 FPS titles coming out for like the PlayStation 5, it doesn't look notably worse. Right. And I think that's one thing that everyone's going to appreciate when they see this running on their PlayStation 5 locally again. But it's a weirdly superfluous title, like you said there, Oliver, with regards to the fact that the PlayStation 4 backwards compatibility version already on PS5 was pretty solid, really good. I think like we measured that it could drop some frames when you went to like certain areas of the map with a lot of stuff and hordes in them, or freakers as they call them,
like those big 200 odd NPC hordes. Those were pretty demanding, and you could see, I do recall from my time playing it on PS5, you could see some drops in those sequences in particular, although it was not common through typical gameplay. But I think like Shuhei Yoshida said, they kind of need these remasters to pad out the schedule and to provide funding for new games and to make sure that developers have some source of revenue that can be attributed back to them, right? I think we're just going to see this a lot throughout the generation. We've already seen it a lot. And it is a bit superfluous, but they kind of need to pad out the schedule here. So give them a bit of a boost there.
It makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I would actually be really liking if this led to the green lighting of the sequel again. It would be kind of, because I'd rather see Sony Bend working on a single player action game than a games as a service title, which they might have ended up producing. Yeah, we'll see when it comes out. And I think this is one we're going to cover just because it would be good to pay dues to the developers in the series, which we actually looked rather fondly on in our original video. That was a John video back in the day. So let's move on to the next game. Now, this one is a game that I was really happy to see, and specifically very happy to see this developer working on a game again. And this is Saros. Am I saying that right? Saros from Housemarque, who made, back in 2020, I believe it was, or 2021, Returnal. I was given the strange task of covering a PlayStation 5 title when I'm the PC guy. And usually I don't like playing games on console. And here I was like, whoa, what is this game? It's like a mix of body horror and existential horror and really cool arcadey rogue gameplay. And it was fantastic. Returnal is an amazing game. And then it came out on PC, which I was grateful for in spite of some issues. But here we're seeing Saros, which based upon, I mean, from the trailer itself, you can get a sense that it is building on the ideas of Returnal. Just the main character is talking about essentially waking up and reliving an experience again, which is very much like Returnal. But this time around, you're playing as a guy and not a gal, and you have a gun, and you're looking at some sort of strange, I don't know, science fiction mixed with, I have no idea what's going on in this trailer, but reading the PS blog about this entry, it does seem to be building on the gameplay from Returnal. And they kind of hint at that at the end of the trailer, where it zooms in on the character's eye and you see the kind of characteristic arcade shooter kind of boss battle level of projectiles showing up in his eye there, and they start spiraling toward him. which you could find all over Returnal. Tons of enemies had these kind of projectile attacks that you'd have to dodge and avoid. But here, I think the key difference, as the blog points out and as hinted in the trailers, like coming back stronger. So if you do die in this game, maybe there'll be a similar system to Returnal where the world rearranges and you do get a somewhat of a reset, but there will be more progression through deaths in this game, which maybe it disappoints some, but I think I actually like that idea. But the one thing that I did not like about all of this is the fact that the trailer was a pre-rendered one. Yeah, I've got a lot to say about that, but anyone else want to take this one?
Yeah. I mean, it's a new Housemarque game. That's always very exciting. But like Alex said, the trailer doesn't say too much, unfortunately, and it's hard to read anything into it at all in terms of rendering, really, because it's a pre-rendered trailer and it's CGI, and is it even an engine? Maybe not. It's certainly not game quality assets, I can't imagine here. But yeah, it is basically a sequel to Returnal in some sense, a spiritual successor to Returnal. Not in terms of plot, but in gameplay systems, in terms of kind of a roguelite structure. I'm interested in that. Not necessarily drawn to it, but interested in it because, frankly, Returnal was too hard for me. I got to the second world there, and I kind of had to stop. And I didn't like the progression, or rather the lack thereof. Like, you don't really have too much that persists between saves outside of your progression through, like, the start of each world or whatever, each level. That was a little bit of a lean offering for players who might not be the most skilled at that kind of bullet hell type of shooter there. But here it does sound like you get permanent upgrades. Every time you die, you quote unquote come back stronger, as the trailer suggests. And in the PlayStation blog, they specifically say like suit and weapon upgrades are on the table here. That sounds like a bit of a relief to me. So hopefully the game experience is like a little bit more gentle and maybe a little bit more configurable depending on how much time you want to spend, you know, grinding things out, exploring new areas, or if you want to like rush straight through to the boss, it's probably a lot more challenging. That seems more approachable to me, which is probably a good thing because I don't think Returnal sold exceptionally well. It was a very, very good game, but I don't think it sold exceptionally well. Maybe this is a way to get it to a bit of a broader audience there. They also talk about a narrative with more NPCs, more characters, a little bit more conventional narrative, whereas Returnal was like a little bit more hostile. I mean, it was a very hostile world, yes, of course, but it was a bit more cryptic. You know, it was mostly a kind of the main character. There was a lot of focus on that main character, not as much of a focus on any kind of like conventional storytelling. I'd still like it if Housemarque maybe went back to more traditional, very arcadey styles of games like Nex Machina, right? That was a game that I really enjoyed from 2017. But I think this is a more appealing title to me personally than Returnal, and I'm excited to see it in action later this year, they say.
Yeah, for me, I'm also interested in the technological aspect. Unfortunately, the trailer being pre-rendered CGI, which is my big complaint. Like, man, the cutscenes in Returnal looked already pretty good, I actually thought. So I really could have expected them to show in an in-engine cutscene. But I guess here, maybe they hired out a studio who did this really impressive bit of pre-rendered video here in terms of the visuals. At least it's good pre-rendered content, but you know, I would have loved to seen more just so I could get an appreciation of the technology already. Returnal is a UE4 game. It has UE issues in it, but it also was doing a lot more than standard Unreal. I think the way the world was constantly switching in and out with itself, the particle system that the game used was wholly unique and really well done, and it drove most of the game. Even some of the creature design was driven by it, and I think that's really cool. And it would be interesting to see what they would do with later versions of Unreal and their own enmeshing of technology there, because I presume they would upgrade to get some of the advantages that later Unreal provides, whether in terms of lighting or just in terms of general raw performance. The engine has become a lot more efficient ever since Returnal came out. So I'd be curious to see that, but unfortunately this trailer doesn't tell us much about it. Excited to see more about this, hopefully some gameplay soon enough, but until then, let's move on to the next title. Okay, so this next title is Dreams of Another from the State of Play here, and this one caught our eye because it looked so radically different. from a visual perspective than the other titles. And not to just talk here soliloquy, but it's actually using rendering tech that they don't see too often in the games. Now, the gameplay itself here, I had a really hard time deciphering what it was about in the trailer. I mean, they show very contrasting visuals with what appears to be the core gameplay mechanic is, which is shooting stuff with a submachine gun. I don't know exactly how that ties into the narrative of the game, because that seems like a gameplay verb, which is almost at contrast with what the visuals are showing us. It's pretty weird. This is from Q Games, I believe, right? Mm-hmm. And the technology is probably the reason why we're talking about this, because the trailer itself is just it's really hard to parse exactly what I'm seeing in terms of a narrative and gameplay. But the technology was one that was really easy to look at and say, that's what we're seeing. And I think this was elaborated elsewhere, but it is using point cloud rendering. And if I were to guess at the trailer, basically point cloud would be like, in 3D space, you would just map out the location of a single point, and then how do you represent that point visually on screen? And there they chose what appears to be camera-facing quads, and you can see that when any of the character close-ups occur, you can see that, or any of the environmental close-ups as well too, you can see that there's little like strips almost, rectangles, squares that turn and face the camera as it's moving. And they're also shaded though as if they are taking up 3D space. Mm-hmm. So it's both messing with your perception as a result of that, because they have 3D space lighting, but it's turning to face the camera, much like a sprite would. And it gives the game an extremely unique style. We haven't seen too much of this in real-time rendering before. The closest thing we've seen is another Dreams game, is Dreams. But even then, that did it differently. I believe the original research for Dreams was looking at using point clouds for doing all of the rendering, as well as with like a camera-facing like strip system, I think they called it at the time. But they ended up shipping something slightly more traditional for the end game, for a variety of reasons. Like I think they wanted, for like creativity reasons, it was easier to author things using with the way they did it for the launch version of that game. But here, this is pretty rare, and it's actually, interesting enough, point clouds, at least the way they're doing it here with these like what looks to be quads of geometry that are I think they're just like maybe like just the color, the base color, and then they're shaded in 3D space. I think the last time we've seen stuff like this more in games was actually in the 90s when games were doing CPU rendering. That's when we'd see more of this kind of thing. So this is really interesting from a visual perspective. But Oliver, what did you think of the trailer beyond like the core tech?
That's a good question, because I really do think this game is completely defined by its core technology. And I mean, part of that is just I can't quite tell exactly what the gameplay is comprised of here, but also I just think like that point cloud system animation is really tough with that, and you can kind of see some of that in this trailer where it's quite stiff. It doesn't look really up to that quality bar that you'd expect in a game with normal polygonal rendering. No question of budget here, just the style of rendering is does not really work with normal mesh animation systems, so obviously that's going to be a little bit different. And you need some workarounds to light them, and I'm sure they have that all working, because it does seem like they're lit appropriately in this engine here. But yeah, it's a little bit hard to make any kind of judgment as to the gameplay of this game beyond just saying it's a point cloud game where you shoot things and things emerge from them, like you make a door or something. It seems very enigmatic in that sense. But yeah, I mean, it certainly is interesting looking. I hope it's as interesting playing as it looks, but I also just kind of feel like they need to do something really, really interesting with that point cloud system here to justify it, because you have so many compromises, I feel, as a result of leaning into that point cloud system for a game like this, that you need to get a lot of value out of the other end, or else it's just like an interesting demo that you can poke around and look at and find some novelty in, but not something that would actually work that well as an actual game. That's my suspicion. But of course, we need to withhold judgment until we actually see the final game in more detail here.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Oliver, because there's a lot of reasons why the industry kind of collated around, or like decided upon using triangles at the end and driving skeletal meshes, is because for approximating our reality, it was a good way to do it that was efficient and more artist friendly. And there were obviously a lot of other alternative rendering paradigms that existed at the same time, because everything was being done by CPU rendering. But then GPUs came around and graphics acceleration, and the quickest way to do a lot of these things was just with triangles. And here we see almost like an alternative future where we're using the same amount of GPU and the same amount of CPU to drive an entirely different rendering paradigm. And the GPUs and CPUs were not necessarily built around these things. So it's like looking at a future that could have been, but a bit mitigated as a result. Yeah. I'm curious to see what it looks like. I don't know, Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, my gut reaction was that it looks like a Saturn game because of the quads. It has that aesthetic. I mean, I always like to champion games which try something a bit new, especially when, like as you said, Alex, at the start, there's a lot of games here which in this presentation which looked very similar in some respects, like action combat. And we live in an age where just about every other game is games as a service shooter or a Dark Souls clone. So it's great to see something getting the limelight like this, which is going the extra mile to try something a bit new. It's coming out in sometime this year, Dreams of Another. And I was interested to see it's coming out on PSVR 2, which is going to be one heck of a head trip. Like, just imagine jumping into that world with all this, everything you see around you, like falling and like crumbling like sand. The concept is interesting. It always feels like a rebellion against the popular gameplay standards of today. You know, instead of shooting to destroy, you're shooting to create and manipulate the environment using these point cloud, technology. And so I quite like the concept. But yeah, as you say, it needs to come together in a concrete game design that, I can't imagine. Wow, I have a suspicion it won't be a long game. It'll be sort of a 3, 4, 5 hour special. Which
I get that feeling
enough.
too. Yeah,
which is
fine.
enough, I think.
That's fine. Yeah. So this is the last title we're going to be talking about from the Sony State of Play showcase, and it is Lost Souls Aside. This one, I don't know. I'm looking at it and I'm seeing very much so it is Unreal Engine title. Very much so as well that it is a third-person character action game, which we saw a lot of here. But I do want to say that it did at least visually look pretty all right. I don't know. Oliver, what was your appreciation?
Ringing endorsement from Alex Battaglia. Well, I just wanted to cover some of this game's development history because it actually has a very storied history and possibly a somewhat challenging history. It's been in development for 9 years now. First as a one-man passion project, and then they expanded to a larger team and a larger team since. And it seems very like Final Fantasy inspired to me. It looks a lot like, it's giving me a lot of like FF15 vibes, which makes sense because the FF15 came out around that time period. I feel like I'm getting a lot of that influence just in the way the game plays, the way it looks, the kind of acrobatics of the combat, the settings, the kind of modern fantasy look and aesthetic there. I think it's very much of that ilk. In terms of the visuals, the brief cutscene snippets look great. Gameplay not as much. It is UE4 based, Unreal Engine 4. Presumably because it started development so long ago. They might be on quite an old version at this point. And that makes sense. It fits the visuals we're seeing pretty well. I agree. It is very Unreal Engine-like. It's another major Chinese AAA console release, which I think is pretty cool. Black Myth Wukong was a really big success last year, obviously. And this is kind of hitting some of the same notes, I would say, even if it is very different. Like, it feels like a game that probably is going to have quite polished combat. They actually showed off some combat demos a number of years ago, and the combat looked pretty good even then. Kind of like a Devil May Cry-ish, Final Fantasy-ish kind of action RPG combat hybrid there. Looked quite good. And there's a lot of crowd-pleasing stuff here in terms of the characters, the action, something pretty familiar, I would say, but also a little bit fresh here. I think it's a game that's going to resonate hopefully, I mean, I don't know. Hopefully it's a good game. Hopefully it resonates with audiences, because I think there is something here that is quite appealing, and I hope they can pull it off.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot going for it in terms of it being, well, it's stuck in UE4 territory, which isn't like to say it's damned, like, you know, there's plenty of great UE4 titles, but I think there's a big contrast between the visual quality in this one and what we saw in Tides of Annihilation. Like, I think there's a little bit of a contrast there, but it still looks great. It's a PS5 and PC exclusive, is
Yeah,
that
it's published
right?
by Sony.
Seems about right.
Published by Sony,
SIE,
so
yeah.
and 30th of May release date, so that's not too far away. So the fact it's got such a protracted sort of development cycle, it's always great to see these games actually come to fruition as a final product. You just, because it you know, a lot of work has gone into this, and it's always interesting to see the outcome. I did have a look at the sort of frame rate and resolution stuff. Again, it's all sort of such an early days, and it's all based on the trailer, but it's captured on PS5. We're getting resolution range of 1080p to 1512p, which I can believe, given the, you know, it looks...
It's UE4. Yeah.
It's UE4, yeah. That's kind of where I'd expect it to be. And yeah, there are drops under the target 60, like going down into the 50s and 40s based on the feed. But hey, it could be that's all solved by release. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's not like I didn't know anything about the history of that. It was really interesting to hear what Oliver had to say about that. It's made me even more interested in this one, actually.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I actually, when Oliver said that, I could actually remember the original demos, because this was one of those like Square Enix hire this man kind of things. But it was actually impressive that it was made by one, starting at least what we saw originally, those original one-person demos. I actually do recall them. But this one's pretty cool. I guess will be another one of those games from this barrage of trailers that will be hopefully covering in the near future when they do release. So the state of play was rather long and showed off a lot of games, and so we can't cover every single one, but there was a collection of titles scattered throughout it that we wanted to dedicate at least a little bit of time about, as well as talk about the state of play in general. So the first title that we do want to talk about here is I want to first start with actually a slightly negative one, and that is Borderlands 4. Now this one is interesting. I covered partially Borderlands 3 back in the day, and the reason why talking about Borderlands 4 is interesting is because it is a series which has evolved over time with all the iterations of Unreal. You go back and, you know, it's one of the Unreal Engine 3 games, Unreal Engine 4 games, and now Unreal Engine 5. And if you were to take, for example, in my humble opinion, if you go back to Borderlands 2 and you take a look at this trailer of Borderlands 4, you would be sometimes scratching your head, actually, at the visual differences you're seeing on there. And now some of that is down to the art style kind of flattening the presentation out, which I think is readily visible here. Like, you kind of lose a lot of the big bells and whistles from Unreal Engine as soon as you start cartoonifying it heavily. That's not a bad thing, but also keeping within that Borderlands style, it does not make it look as fresh and as current gen as the other titles that we saw maybe in this showcase as a result. But the other thing is also gameplay. We'll have to see when that comes out, but man, I thought I kind of like the way Borderlands 1 was going. Borderlands 2 souped things up with a lot of cool destruction, especially on the PC version of that game, but it was also really heavily leaning into the RPG gun shooter thing, which I have come to start to dislike. But currently with this Borderlands 4 trailer, I was none too happy with it on a visual perspective, and as well gameplay didn't really do too much for me. Now this one, Oliver, can you talk about it? There's another Sonic game coming out.
Yes. Well, I don't know that Alex is too excited about this one, but I am very, very excited about this one. I think this looks great. It reminds me a lot of Sonic Racing Transformed, that 2012, I believe, kart racer, in terms of the way the game is handling, in terms of the weapons, in terms of the vehicle switching when you move between different areas. it looks like the central gimmick here on top of that Sonic Racing Transformed foundation is that you get to pick the next section of track when you're the leading car in sort of a portal system, sort of similar to Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart a little bit here, but you have some control over that system and you go into this next world. You're foisted into the next world, and that's like the next lap of any given track that you go on, and that's pretty interesting, I think. There's lots of customization and items that they've gone through and they've detailed, but the core racing gameplay looks a lot like Transformed, and I'm hoping that holds true for the final game. Visually, a little bit less positive, perhaps. It's a bit dated, I would say. It is a Switch game as well, of course, and it's on last-gen consoles and current-gen consoles, so it has to work on pretty low-power hardware relative to a lot of the other games in this showcase. I do think that Team Sonic Racing does probably look a little bit better than this, or even substantially better than this, and that was a Switch game as well. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but here the focus seems to be a little bit more on really big worlds with really big scale, something really big and arcadey, not like Team Sonic Racing, which was a little bit more laid back, a little bit more in that Mario Kart vein, that kind of restricted scale. Here they're giving you a really big environment to look at and explore, and dinosaurs here and there, and big areas around the track with lots of water and lots of crazy things and mountains. It's almost a little bit reminiscent, I thought, of Cruise and Blast on the Switch.
Oh wow,
if you remember that. In terms of the
John covered
really
that.
big arcadey environments, but maybe without a lot of the visual decoration that other games are delivering potentially. Now, in terms of rendering tech, this actually stumped me, but I did some research, and it looks like it's Unreal Engine, judging from the game's online.
Oh, what a
menu,
surprise!
which I was confused by, although not totally unconvinced by. There are some things that I think point to Unreal outside of that the simple fact that we do know it's Unreal, based on the fact that it's licensing Unreal technology, because in some areas the indirect diffuse lighting looks pretty good, more modern than you might expect from other engines, from your Unities, from your possible in-house engines at Sega.
Right.
And the SSR, to me, looks pretty Unreal-like to me. It looks a little bit like that Unreal SSR. It looks pretty reminiscent of that Unreal SSR. But the materials and models, it's not a very Unreal look to me. It looks very stripped back relative to a lot of Unreal Engine titles. Again, it's working on Switch, so maybe that stuff wouldn't be appropriate for Switch. They want to have a consistent visual look. They don't want to have to simplify the materials, whatever. That makes sense. The last thing here is that this is not developed by Sumo Digital. They developed the prior Sonic kart racing games, but this is a Sega joint internally. But apparently they have some people working on this game who have a lot of racing game experience, and hopefully this can work out well. I was really excited to see this. Yeah. This is probably my number one game of the show. Probably not my number one game of the show in terms of its technical attributes, but I'm super excited to play this. I know John is too. We both signed up for the network test. Hopefully we get in, and maybe we can enjoy some kart racers, because to me, the Sonic kart racers are the best kart racers available outside of Mario Kart. They're really, really high quality games. So hopefully this one will be too.
That's a ringing endorsement. I recall playing the first title on PC because it was one of the few comfy couch local co-op games on PC of that time era. It was something you couldn't find actually in a lot of titles, especially on Steam when it wasn't curated, and it was in the curated list. So I definitely played this one quite a bit. The original, the Transformed one that you just talked about. Yeah, and that was pretty cool. So if this is anything like that, this will probably be pretty great. Okay.
Yeah. Right there with you. I mean, I love Transformed, and that going back to the day that came out, like I remember that was actually a Wii U title as well, and that had this feature where you could play with 5 people with one person on the gamepad. Complete like aside, but I just really fond memories. So yeah, I'm right there with Oliver on this one. It's great to see. It returned to land, sea, and air racing, and the travel ring system should be interesting. I'd be very intrigued to see if that mechanic runs smoothly on Switch, because the leader of the pack decides which ring to enter, which determines where the rest of the races go through, what area the rest of the races go through. So I wonder if that streaming system will work equally well on a Tegra system, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Cool. next title, it was actually two, but I think we're going to focus mainly on one, is there was two games announced from the Onimusha series. There's the re-release of Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny, which is originally a PlayStation 2 game, if I'm not mistaken. And then there is a new game targeting current gen and PC called Onimusha Way of the Sword, which appears to be using, based upon what I saw, this is Capcom, this is CryEngine. Two very different titles in terms of tech vintage here, still within the same series and somewhat similar gameplay formula. But Tom, it seems like you had quite a bit to say about this one.
Yeah, I mean, more so actually the Onimusha 2 remaster than the new game. But Way of the Sword looks great. I mean, you've got like a combat where you can like kick along tatami mats, and it feels like, Onimusha always had this strange link to. It always almost released coincided with the Devil May Cry series. Like,
you're right,
like on PS2, there's 1, 2, 3 on the same system. But yeah, very, very great. It looks like it's using CryEngine, as you might expect from Capcom. But yeah, I was more interested by Onimusha 2 remaster, just for now anyway, because of the presentation of the trailer. Going back to those PS2 era titles is a bit of a challenge, especially with the way Capcom engineered a lot of their games in that time. Where they were pioneered, really like top of the class in terms of pre-rendered backdrops. They did this for Resident Evil games of that era. And so it followed for Onimusha 1 and 2. I think 3, they pushed for more 3D polygonal environments. But with 2, there's a hybrid approach. And a lot of the pre-rendered backdrops you can see in the trailer have an upscale applied to them, which is as intelligent as you could hope for. And they're animating backdrops as well. So there's like rain falling. It's like super detailed stuff. But how it appears in the result is you've got the, nicely upscaled 4K boost to the geometric elements, the characters, the 3D parts of the environment. Then that meshes with the pre-rendered stuff, like in the background sometimes, and you just think, that doesn't look quite like it's in sync. But that's kind of with the territory. They kept it, the scope of the remaster project kind of contained to reworking the assets that they had from that time. I suppose the only other point on that is that they have they're kind of keeping it faithful in terms of the aspect ratios. You've got a full 3 aspect ratio mode and a 16:9 aspect ratio mode. The 16:9 one is cropped, and it crops the top and bottom to kind of frame it, which makes sense given there's pre-rendered backdrops. That isn't so malleable. But
no,
but yeah, it's an interesting project, and I think a good way to onboard fans ahead of the new game coming out. So yeah, definitely an interesting one.
Now, this is something John actually talks about quite often, is how do you present games from an era when the sets that were going to be displaying these games were inherently low resolution in general, like 480p at best, sometimes interlaced. I actually don't know about this game if it was interlaced or not. And then you also have the fact that the sets that these were on back then were malleable in terms of what resolution they could display at. It wasn't always at 480p. There could be intermediate resolutions, and screens of that era would actually display them in a pretty good way. And in a case like this one, it's one of the ways to solve the problem is to upscale the backgrounds that are 2D elements and then present them mixed in with ultra high resolution 3D elements. We've seen that a lot in the past before, and it's actually something that PC games in the 90s would have to suffer from a lot if you got a console port. But I don't know if it's the best way to do things. And here I would hope there is a mode that maybe retains the original resolution for the output, but then either through the application of a CRT filter or maybe really good integer scaling brings that up to full res and full screen size close to full screen size on a modern set. And that could include things like super sampling the geometry, so you don't get extra aliasing in there, but you get, at least a good look. And I think that's maybe one of the options that they could add in here. It's something that a lot of developers have struggled with in the past, and I think there's better ways to present it than just one default way, and also maybe give people some options. So that's kind of what I think about that. Okay, let's go on to the next one, and that is called Midnight Walk. Probably the most visually distinctive looking game here. It's a first-person shooter. It looks like a first-person shooter that also is coming out for a variety of platforms, including PSVR, which should be interesting. And I think you very well described it, Tom, when we were talking about this earlier. It kind of is Tim Burton-esque designs in terms of visuals, but also it's going for the creepiness factor. It almost felt like a horror game in some ways throughout the trailer.
It did, yeah.
And first person, almost unexpected, and given how many third person games were in this showcase here. But what do you think about this one, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it was up there with Dreams of Another in terms of being one of the more visually distinct games on the catalog. And just because, the most eye-catching part was the decimated animation on those enemies. There's a lot of some games do this for a stylistic push towards sort of anime aesthetic, like Guilty Gear Xrd love to use decimated animations, and it works well, and in the context of a horror as well, to generate a sense of fear, like something otherworldly. And I think they've nailed it. They've really, right away, the visual appeal is apparent, and it's a first-person game with some shooting in there. I have no idea how much they're going to push that part of it, but it is. It's got this sort of Nightmare Before Christmas world. And one of the interesting things reading the developer blog about how they're making it is they've created clay molds, clay creatures, all these monsters in real life, and then scanned them into the game engine itself. And from that, we're getting some beautiful, very realistic material interactions with lighting, which is a key mechanic of the game. There's like a sidekick called Pot Boy, who's got like a flame for a head, and you kind of have to, he lights your way through the world. And so you're kind of like walking through the darkness, trying to evade enemies, sometimes encountering them by the looks of things. And then you've got, because you're kind of miniaturized, you're also bumping into like giant matches, which you can also use to light your way. So it's very inventive. It reminds me a little bit of Little Nightmares.
I was about to say that. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's just a little bit of that, but in 3D, but with the decimated animation. Anyway, just it was captured on PS5, and by the looks of things, most of the footage they showed was capped at 30 frames per second. I'm going to hazard a guess that they are going to offer a couple of modes here, because there's some footage in the mix which is unlocked 60, which actually looked, like it was dropping quite a bit as well. But it's early days, so that might be something we can look forward to as an alternative mode for VR users, or maybe it'll lock to 60 in the end. But I think that's everything I've got on this one.
Yeah, this is good. Like, I think it was really good that you brought up Guilty Gear, because I've in previous DF Directs criticized decimated animation. I think it has its place still, obviously, for going for a very specific style. And if it is, you are trying to look like claymation or something like that, I think that it really works. Another great game that we never ended up covering on the channel, which was a bit of a shame, that did a similar scanning process, was Harold's Halibut. That came out last year. I believe it was in April of last year, and that was another game where they had a really heavily inspired stop motion look to the game, but rendered in real time. But that was not a first-person game. And I'm curious to see how that translates to first-person, because you mentioned a lot of this presenting here at 30 FPS, and I'm curious if it was actually 30 FPS, or if it was so much decimated animation that it was maybe rendering at 60, but it looked like 30.
Yeah.
So
camera was at 30.
Yeah,
for sure. But yeah, it was just the animation on the enemies that was like decimated.
Right.
So
exactly.
Could be 15.
Okay, well then that's even more intense. Not sure how good that'll feel if that is the end up target, but we'll have to see when the game comes out. But I think this was, at least from everything I saw, next to the point cloud game there that we just talked about, I thought it was probably the most visually interesting looking game that we saw at the showcase. And I think this is where we should transition to talking about the showcase itself. I don't know. I had rather mixed opinions on it, and I think we all have something to say, but I'm going to start with you, Oliver.
Yeah. Well, there were sure a lot of games. I think it was like 40 games. And there was sure a lot of Unreal Engine. Probably half the games here, at least, are on Unreal. And, like a lot of Unreal Engine games, you can tend to spot them a bit of a mile away. So that's a little bit unfortunate here, but there were certainly a lot of them here, and they often didn't differentiate themselves too much in terms of rendering. I was personally expecting a couple of games to be here that weren't here. So Ghosts of Yorte, Death Stranding. I was expecting to see a little bit out of one of those titles, potentially. I was also expecting to see a God of War collection that's been rumored in the rumor mill for a while. Seems like a real thing. So I didn't necessarily get what I wanted out of it. And honestly, outside of like the Sonic game and a couple of other ones that were highlights for me, I didn't see a whole lot that really caught my eye here. I did see a lot of great looking cutscenes, but not as much gameplay. And I would really prefer these trailers focus more on gameplay. That is something that I think Xbox does much better with their developer directs. These trailers are like movie trailers, basically. That's how they're cut. That's how they're presented. And movie trailers are much more analogous to that final product than you get with a game and a game trailer. Like, you really need more hand-holding. You need more explanation of what it's like to play. You need to see gameplay mechanics in action. And if they're novel gameplay mechanics, you need them explained to you, right? I guess I'm fine with some rapid-fire trailers, as long as they're interspersed with more extended looks at games of particular interest to the audience. And my concern is that we didn't really get that here. And that, I think, is what lets me down with these Sony showcases, is they can show you things that are interesting here, maybe not as much as with some other showcases, but they often don't give you that kind of extended look that you can really sink your teeth into and really experience the game like the developer wants you to experience it.
Yeah, it did. It kind of feel like it blurred into one for a lot of it. And I almost feel like in terms of purely in terms of how they present these shows, it does need more of a front person to be kind of like the ringleader. They had some presenters and some of the directors and producers like speaking on behalf. They had the Randys speaking about Borderlands, which, that works. It injects some personality into the proceedings, but it felt like Sony's presentation of it exists in a vacuum. Like, it's a little bit lacking emotion and lacking the weight of occasion, which I think Nintendo Direct sometimes has, and definitely like the Keighleys. There's always like a big and now for one last thing at the end of it. And, as a bit of a pipe dream, but a Bloodborne something or other might have been nice after the recent court filings, against the mods. Maybe even Bloodborne Kart Racer. Who knows? That would have been nice.
Yeah, port that to PS5. That's
No, it was great. It was good, but there wasn't like an exceptional wow moment. I think the game we led with really says it all. Like Tides of Annihilation was one of the standouts in terms of tech and looking like a very cohesive end game. But besides that, there weren't too many surprises. Like, it was just like a lot of interesting curiosities and yeah. But I think we said this before as well, that we've got a lot of games to cover, which is always a positive. Like, there's a lot of stuff on the slate now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also say, much like Oliver did, where, gosh, so many titles, a lot of them using the same visual feature set from a similar engine, an unfortunate number of them being almost back to back while being like third-person action games. With like really aloof dialogue that is really cut really quickly. And after a number of those titles, and then you get through a lot of other titles too, then you start forgetting about the titles you saw. And then the naming doesn't help too. So you've got like this blur of titles. And they all, some of them start to look more similar to each other as a result of that, even though they might actually be different. And then you have these like names. And we were really struggling while putting together this video due to some of the names of these games. Like, I'm really sorry, but like Lost Souls aside, Dreams of Another, Tides of Annihilation, like, oh my goodness. They almost sound like a lot of direct-to-video things from like the early 2010s or late 2000s. Like, they really do sound like that. And combining all those, like these names, these big noun names, and the sameness of the trailers in terms of how they're cut, sameness of some game designs due to the fact that they're all, like, a lot of them are third person, etc., all on Unreal. It was just like a big blur to me in the end. And the few standout titles were because they didn't look a lot like anything else. For example, the last one we just talked about now, Midnight Walk, didn't look like anything else there, so that's why it really stuck out to me. And I think that is a shame, because maybe with less titles and maybe more of these type of state of play things told in the style of a developer direct, it doesn't need to be so intense. It doesn't need to be a 20-minute segment, but maybe even just like 5 to 7 minutes, talking a bit more dedicated about each game individually, spread out over a longer period of time. You know, not everything we don't need 40 titles for this one showcase. Maybe then I would appreciate it more, and maybe each of these titles would find their niche audience better instead of blending and looking similar to each other, which is what happened for me. And I think this is something that Sony needs to work on. And back in the day, we criticized Xbox and Microsoft a lot for this, and they've, not because of us or anything like that, but they've actually changed their presentation style over time. And I hope that Sony gets around to doing that in the future too, because I think it'll do justice to titles that probably deserve it better. And yeah, you know, I think it's just a general problem with the industry. And yeah, in general, trailers don't show nearly enough about the game in the depth with the context that we need to make us actually appreciate it. And it's aping an art form, which games aren't. Games aren't movies, right? So it would be interesting if we actually went more interactive with the way we talk about games. But that is just kind of the way I see it. And I think that is the end of our discussion of State of Play. So gentlemen, let's move on to this next news topic. So this next topic is a bit of a somber one, but it appears, based upon reporting and a direct message from the company as posted on X, that Crytek is laying off around 15% of its workforce. And as it says also in the statement, that Crysis 4 was put on hold of as of quarter 3 2024, and the team is kind of focusing right now on The Hunt, their kind of darling, I don't know what you'd call it. It's kind of an extraction shooter. It's a pretty great game, PvE, PvP. We've talked about it a couple times on the channel now. But in general, this is really sad news to hear. And I think I'm the resident Crysis guy, and I've got to say, I'd heard a little bit about this behind the scenes, but I didn't want to ever comment on it because, well, it's not my place. But it is a real shame, both for the people who are losing work as a result of this, and also in general for Crytek, which is a company that I feel like ever since Crysis 2 has been really struggling in a lot of ways. It's morphed and downsized and sold off its engine, and I don't even know if they're in the engine business so much so anymore as a result of that. And they didn't have many avenues for revenue. And I always felt like the popularity of a games as a service can only go on for so long. Only so many skins can be sold, only so many seasons can be sold before people maybe start wanting to move on, even if it is a wholly unique game like The Hunt is. And in this case, I thought maybe Crysis 4 would be a good way for them to get some money as well as some prestige and reputation back after kind of the issues that happened around the time of Rise and the thereafter. But it doesn't seem like it'll be the case for the immediate future. So it is a really big shame, and my heart does go out to all those affected by layoffs. But I don't know. What do you guys think of this one, Oliver?
Yeah, I think it's disappointing in part because Hunt Showdown, I think it's a good game. It's a good game for a certain kind of person. I'm not that kind of person personally. And reorganizing the studio, it seems like around Hunt while abandoning their flagship series is a bit weird. But at the same time, I can kind of understand it from a couple different angles here, because a Crysis game has super high expectations, and they have to meet those expectations potentially with not the same size of team as some other developers might have to iterate on their flagship franchises. And the engine technology also probably needs a bit of a refresh and technical evolution before it would really satisfy the needs of players who are looking for a top-end PC experience, or even like a really advanced console experience potentially, if that's what they want to deliver. And, you know, development is long. Maybe you need some additional funding, some additional investment. You need probably some outside investment there. And maybe they ran into some development issues on top of that. It's been, I think, a little over 2 years since they made the announcement they were working on Crysis 4. So they've had some time, presumably in pre-production and possibly in production, and they may have encountered some issues there. So perhaps refocusing on Hunt plus a smaller title makes sense. But I kind of feel like that Crysis IP is super valuable. And makes more sense to me to exploit than anything else Crytek could probably be working on realistically. The Crysis games are absolutely legendary, so maybe a spin-off, something a little bit smaller, who knows, maybe that could work. They had those remasters, obviously. Presumably they sold okay, at least, hopefully. Maybe
I hope they did. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe there's some indications to whether that would be successful or not. But they're in a kind of a weird situation because they also have CryEngine, but outside of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which does make use of the engine, does make very effective use of the engine, they really don't seem to have any upcoming third-party games that use CryEngine, unless you're counting Amazon Lumberyard games. Maybe that's a fork of CryEngine, but it's so long ago, and I don't even know what titles are using Amazon Lumberyard, to be honest, at this point. So I don't really know where you go with this combination of factors, like Crysis 3 and Rise, Son of Rome. Both those games came out in 2013. That was kind of like the last hurrah, in my view, of Crytek, of the big Crytek era where they were like super dominant in terms of pushing out new technologies, in terms of iterating on CryEngine in really new and exciting ways, both on PCs and then of course later on the consoles. And Crysis 4 seemed like a huge bright spot for me, and I would have loved to have seen that project move forward, even if it was maybe not everything that Crysis 4 was in some players' heads. Maybe if it was a little bit of a smaller scale title, maybe if it wasn't pushing out the most advanced visuals. I still like the Crysis games in terms of gameplay. I still like them in terms of art. I still think they do a terrific job with that kind of stuff. It doesn't need to be absolutely everything in the world, but evidently they found that it was not working out, and I can understand that. But yeah, it's a bit of a disappointment. I'd love to see them revisit that at some point in the future, if at all possible. But yeah, I just hope they work on something interesting and work on something that actually is a big success for them.
Well, I think the first thing to say is, I really feel for all the people who have been laid off. That can't be an easy bullet to bite. And I really hope their work on what they've been working on at Crytek gets, appreciated in wherever they end up next. That helps propel them forward. As far as Crysis 4 is concerned, I'm gutted because Crysis is one of those big games, the sort of tentpole PC games, which I couldn't wait to replay again and again whenever I upgraded my GPU back in the day. And Warhead as well I have a fond memory of that. But so I was actually banking on Crysis 4 being the big comeback moment for Crytek. And now it does feel like that's kind of slumping back with the director, according to the VGC news article, having gone back to IO Interactive, which is where he originally came from. So that's a real sort of damning indictment of the state of the project, and I think that's going to set it back a good, if it's even still ongoing, it's going to set it back a good few years. I really hope to be proven wrong on that. But as far as CryEngine, I'm still surprised to see, I was looking at where CryEngine is nowadays. Are there any games? And obviously there's Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, but then that's, I suspect, purely because Warhorse Studios was it kind of inclined to use the same technology as its first game. The first game was made to release in like 2018 or so. Production on that started many, like 3-4 years prior to that, when CryEngine was like a very viable, compelling engine to use. You know, we even had a Sonic game built on that engine at the time. So around that period, and Rise was hot, Rise on Xbox One. So it was the emergent technology of that era. But so Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 being on that is just sort of a legacy choice, I think. So shame, and I don't see any others on the horizon. So the Hunt Showdown feels like it, unless Crytek really rallies around building a new, completely revised engine and gives it a good final push, I guess. And it would have to be Crysis 4 that
it would have to be. Like there's no other debut title to do anything. I mean, like the concept that you just described earlier, Oliver, for example, like staying with the hunt, maybe like can that game get arguably larger? And then how do you bring out new areas and places to sell a product, new revenue streams? And it doesn't actually seem very positive of an outlook, and I don't like that, because I mean the German development community has been rocked in the last couple of years as a result of layoffs, game studios closing, really big names being gobbled up and then chewed and spit out. And for me, I was always really keen on Crytek, not just because of the technology, but it was a studio homegrown here. Really cool success story, really legendary status as a result of games like Crysis 1 especially. And to see that go away over time has always been a shame. And now to see it not having a great future is even more of a shame. I don't know what the future looks like now. I hope Crytek pulls through. I have no idea what that will look like if they pull through. But right now, really big downer news, obviously. So sad, but so it is sometimes in this industry. Really rough place. But I think that's really all we have to say about that topic. Let's move on. So after its delay into 2025, we finally have some more information about Assassin's Creed Shadows with the drop of a trailer discussing PC specs and current-gen console information. And there's also a blog posted with a Q&A from the engineering team there, discussing a lot about the individual technology pieces here. And I thought this was actually a pretty cool, very transparent way to get information across, specifically about the PC version here, as well as a Mac version as listed in those specs, which is, I almost feel like that's a video in its own right when the time comes. Like what is like an M4 running like next to a PC GPU? That should be some interesting stuff. There's a lot going on here. But let's first talk about some of the tech. We kind of knew this a bit beforehand based on comments last year from, I believe, one of the tech directors on the game, but the game will be utilizing ray traced global illumination. And now we see ray traced reflections there on the highest setting. And going through the trailer, this is interesting because I do not think it is a per pixel GI solution.
Nope.
Based upon what we saw in Skull and Crossbones, what's that
Skull
name?
and Bones.
Skull and Bones.
Close.
Which, I don't know. Not a very good game, but it did give us a glimpse at what is coming into Anvil next. Back then when it did release, and it did have an RTGI ray tracing option, which curiously only affected your ship, and it looked to be a probe-based solution. So that'd be putting it, we've seen probe-based RTGI on consoles now. I think some titles that used it quite well would be like The Witcher's remastering for current-gen consoles that used it, The Witcher 3, that is. There's another title that I'm forgetting off the top of my head at the moment. Oh, yeah, Jedi. Jedi also does it too. A more recent one that I'm forgetting. But so it can look good and it can be transformative to the visuals, and especially in a game like this one where it seems that they're going to be, first of all, time of day obviously is a big reason for that. But another thing is that this game also has, I believe, the 4 seasons are in it, so you can't use the baked GI information when the the terrain is all white, covered in snow. It makes a lot of sense that you can't do that. So they also specifically call out an area of the game that I forget what it's called, but basically an area that only works with real-time lighting in general that needs to have some sort of RTGI solution.
The hideout.
The hideout, excuse me. Yes, that scene. Well, we'll all have to see what that is like when the game ships, and I'll talk about a little bit more with the PC specs. The game is also using virtualized geometry, and they have images of this where you can see what looks like clusters, or I don't know, the ID of the exact. They have multicolored IDs to different areas of the image where you can see like the geometry, and you'll notice that it is affecting the areas that seem to be covered by virtual geometry are like the static world structures in terms of like buildings, as well as it looks like distant terrain might be done using this virtualized geometry system. And we'll have to see what it means more when we get to the title. But kind of like earlier Unreal Engine 5 games where nanite wasn't applied to everything, I think that's kind of what we're going to be seeing here, where some things like especially bushes and characters and maybe some environmental debris are not using the system based upon this image here. And so you'll see more traditional level of details changing with them. But for the things using the virtualized geometry system, we'll see a much more fine-grained level of detail. It's kind of called out on the blog as well, too. That will give them a really static and consistent look no matter how far away the camera is and how quickly it moves and stuff like that. So that's what I'm thinking there. There's some more tech in there too. They talk about destruction. We'll see how much that plays into an Assassin's Creed title, but that's interesting as well to see there too. But I think the PC specs were also very interesting. They call out requirement of an SSD. They very nicely call out as well resolution and frame rate, which I'm a big fan of in spec sheets like this. They do mention in the blog that the game, you should probably be playing this with a ray tracing capable GPU, but they do have a selective ray tracing option that will use, I believe, static GI for the overworld. And then if you don't have an RT capable GPU, it will use a software-based GI solution for that one area, the hideout, that requires real-time lighting. I think that is an interesting compromise. We'll actually have to see how viable it is in terms of frame rate and visuals when the game comes out, but it is much more realistic, I would say, and it's not the first time we're seeing this, where a probe-based solution can also have a software fallback. In fact, the original DDGI paper, this is probably basing its technology on, I think that's Morgan McGuire, did talk about how for lower end components, it's really easy, not easy, it's still expensive to do the tracing of rays in a software form. So there's a lot there. I think this game could be pretty great. I think some of the trailer didn't look as good as perhaps the tech notes described. Like, I do think the GI is a little bit coarse. Not as fine-grained as I would like, but I'm very curious to see what those reflections look like. And like any Assassin's Creed game, my goodness, they are monsters on your CPU. I want to see what it takes to actually get this game to 60 in the more dense areas. If you're really looking at only X3D territory there, as well as what the heck is going on consoles. And Oliver, what is going on consoles here?
Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff they're specifying on consoles. They're talking about a 4K 60 mode on consoles using upscaling without ray tracing in typical play. Again, falling back on that, I think, pre-computed GI solution that they have had in some prior Anvil engine games. And that 4K 60 mode, it's very curious because that's a really high resolution. Normally you'd think
it's really high.
Maybe a 1440p target or a 1080p target, even with upscaling for a current generation game, pushing out more advanced visuals here. That's a little bit curious. I also did pixel count the Pro version of the game last year. Did not look so good there with PSSR, unfortunately, in that early showing. And it was about 864p internally. So That would, again, that's kind of like maybe this is 720p territory, maybe it's 800p territory to 4K with FSR2. Again, does not sound like a recipe for success here unless they've uncovered some brand new upscaling technology that they've yet to reveal to the world. But it's not too promising there necessarily. And it is a little bit confusing too, because this class of GPU that's in the PS5 and Series X should be good for something closer to 1080p 60 at medium settings with DRS and upscaling according to the PC settings. Because if you look at the PC settings, something like a 3060 Ti or a 6700 XT, again, maybe a little faster than the consoles, but roughly in that ballpark, maybe of console performance, those are 1080p 60, only 1080p 60, and that's with the selective ray tracing, which again is kind of like not really ray tracing, it's ray tracing in one area. So that's confusing.
And not the rest, yeah.
But again, there are some factors here that make this like kind of a befuddling spec sheet, because like I'm all for using upscaling in your game. Use upscaling in your game. When you're playing your game, use upscaling, I'm all for using dynamic resolution, right? But when you combine upscaling and dynamic resolution on a spec sheet, all of a sudden you've told me very little about the way the game actually performs. So you're telling me that this GPU in a console is good for 4K 60 with DRS, but in a PC it's only good for 1080p 60 with DRS? Like, again,
that's a discrepancy.
We're losing track here. Now, of course, you could say, well, maybe PC, it's more often at 1080p. Maybe on consoles it's 720p. There are some things you could explain here, but again, it's just adding confusion to the end user. And I really wish, at least on that PC side, if you're going to specify upscaling, then specify the modes, right? Specify, is it performance, ultra performance, balance, quality, whatever. And don't specify DRS, because even though DRS is great for the player, it's not great for someone reading a spec sheet. Anyways, just a couple little quibbles there, but those are good. Does make this a little bit confusing, unfortunately. So unless the PC version is like exceptionally bad, you should expect some different scaling here than stated on PC, I have to imagine, at least based on the spec sheet. They don't talk about the 30 FPS mode in any detail, but maybe it could have a hardware RTGI. That's not discussed here. It's kind of implied almost if you're saying that the non-RTGI version is a 60 FPS performance mode on consoles.
Right.
The indirect lighting didn't blow me away necessarily. That was also true in last year's showing. But we haven't seen that much of the game so far. I don't really know. But again, in every shot here, I wasn't like getting that like per pixel RTGI impression that you get out of a game like, let's say, Metro Exodus, where you really do see that fine per pixel, fine-grained lighting detail. Like not a path trace game, but a really nice game with really nice indirect diffuse lighting. That's not necessarily the case here. Early days, but that's not too great. But outside of the console minutia, they also published some Mac specs. So the Mac specs have some of the same frustrations as I do with the PC specs, unfortunately, here, because they specify both Metal FX upscaling and dynamic resolution for all these figures here, and they don't specify what settings Metal FX is running at, or even if it's the temporal version of Metal FX, which is quite good, or the spatial upscaler in Metal FX, which, as you might expect, is not very good. Actually, it looks quite bad. It's a little bit worse than FSR1 in my opinion, in my experience. And across the board, they're only specifying a 30 FPS frame rate, not a 60 FPS frame rate. Across the board, they're only specifying a 30 FPS frame rate, not 60, even on the highest end hardware they have specified here, which is like really confusing to me, because the M3 and the M4 in particular have like sky high single core CPU performance. They're the fastest CPUs on the planet in terms of single core CPU performance. That's a little confusing to me. And the top end of that range too, the M4 Max, M3 Max, whatever, those also have very, very high multi-core performance. So why would hitting 60 be that big of an issue? Plus there's no support for the extended RT, so no support for the ray trace reflections. That's another concern there. But yeah, the performance tiers are also a little bit worrying. Again, not to rant too much, but my M1 Ultra chip is apparently only good for 1080p 30 with software selective RT, aka no RT really, which is confusing. And that's with DRS and upscaling. 1080p 30 for an M1 Ultra. This was a very expensive chip, and it's a very large chip. It's actually two 400mm squared chips put together over a silicon interposer. It's quite a beefy chip there. And with respect to PCs, like in synthetics, it can be as fast as like a 3080 or even a 3090. In games on Mac, it's more often like 3060, 3070 level. The other thing to note here is that for any kind of hardware RT, just the RTGI, no extended RT here, you need an M3 or an M4 chip. But of course, you have to remember that the M2 and M1 Mac chips do not have hardware RT support. It's only the M3 and M4 chips, so anything after like 2023, any Mac after 2023 would have gotten those chips. My Mac does not have those chips. It has an M1 Ultra. And it does not support any a Mac prior to Apple Silicon. It's just distributed as a binary compatible with Apple Silicon here. There's no Intel Mac version. That's another thing. So I have two explanations possibly for this issue to close it out here. One is maybe because Macs don't have VRR displays by default. Maybe they're not too confident that the Macs can hit 60 FPS there consistently. Because if a game does go over budget, you can drop a frame there and that can be more impactful to your gameplay experience, whereas on PC, maybe they're more comfortable with dropping a couple frames there and still saying it's a 60 FPS experience. Now, the Macs do have variable refresh rate displays in some sense. They just cycle between a number of fixed refresh rates, I believe, using the ProMotion technology, which is also what you see on the phones. So they can do like 80 hertz, 120 hertz, 60 hertz, 30 hertz, 40 hertz, 15 hertz, whatever. But they can't do a full variable refresh rate cycling based on the content there. And the Pro Display XDR and the Studio Display, which I have in front of me right here, they're just flat 60 hertz panels. So Apple does not sell any VRR displays as far as I'm aware, even though the ProMotion technology is frequently confused with PC VRR. It's not the same. Macs do support VRR, but not on the displays that Apple sells. The other possibility is that the Mac ports just aren't that great, as we saw with Mirage and iPhone. But of course, the third possibility that maybe is even a little bit more plausible here is that the specs are just a big overestimate and Mac hardware is much closer to similarly spec PC hardware because, I don't know, the PC and console spec is so out of whack that I'm just like, how reliable are these specs really? What am I supposed to read from these specs? And of course, the big obfuscatory fact in all this is that everything's listed with DRS and upscaling. So it's just a slight frustration. But I don't know what you have to think about that, Alex, but it's just frustrating.
My frustration is, well, it's a very typical thing that you see when they talk about games. Like, and we'll see this sometimes too when we try and interact with PR about games to get a better sense about like what the consoles are doing. And they'll say the game's running at 4K and they'll say it's using like the PC Ultra settings or high settings. And then poor, Alex goes into the game and he does the comparison and it's like PC low and it's actually running, sub 720p, The way developers PR talks about consoles is usually very different than the product you end up getting in a lot of ways. Very rarely are they super descriptive because they want to sell the fact that it is the latest and the greatest thing running ever on a console that only costs X amount of money. So that's kind of what I think might be happening here on the console side. They're not giving out as much information because kind of like Skull and Bones, that game also ran really poorly in its 60 FPS mode in terms of like just what you were getting visually out of it. So we'll have to see when the game comes out, but I would not be surprised if what you're getting visually out of the consoles here lines up a lot more with that PC spec, but they just are putting it in a way that makes it look a lot better. The Mac spec thing though, I'm really curious if this is one of those games that was more automatically translated to the Mac platform to
it is a native Apple Silicon port. They do say that. So it is. Yeah,
they do say
it's
that.
It's not crossover or wine or anything.
Well, then the 30 FPS thing is confusing then because you would expect from the CPU side they would at least, if you're still getting like 1440p 30, you could give a 1080p 60 spec then,
right?
As well, right?
Yeah.
Like they do with the PC side. Yet they don't do that. So I don't even know what the heck that means. I don't know. Do you have any clue here, Tom?
Well, I like looking over the Q&A section on Assassin's Creed Shadows. I do think there's a big need for transparency on what exact settings they're using, especially with the DRS setups there. I actually got to see the game myself at a preview event, and the embargo's already well past. We didn't do anything with the footage in the end, I don't believe, but it was like, I think for two main reasons. It was they gave us we were able to capture gameplay, go there, capture PC gameplay on an RTX 4090, but there were no visibility on the settings. They just gave you like, oh, this is a demo build with preset settings for everything. So it was hard to parse exactly what we were getting out of it, but you'd assume it's like the best they had to offer. Whether the ray tracing features were already enabled there is like remains to be seen. but also they gave us so that was 60 FPS at 1080p native. So I was like,
what on earth with a 4090? Oh my gosh.
On a 4090. So I thought, that's maybe not, that's really useful for most YouTube channels, but for Digital Foundry purposes, not quite where we need it to be. But they also gave us B-roll, which was 4K. 4K, 60 FPS, and I presume running on the RTX 4090, and it looks really beautiful. Like this thing was divided into two segments, this demonstration, and I think it's got to be it is the best looking Assassin's Creed, as you'd hope. It definitely surpasses Odyssey and Valhalla in that respect. It's like, it feels like a bit of not a full generational leap, maybe like a 33%, 50% step. And you get just it does look incredible. Partly owed to the setting, feudal Japan, but also partly because they're really honing in on this story focus with the two main characters who you can switch between. And they open out this whole thing with a really linear, like more visually focused set piece, like set in like a dark area, a dark sort of siege on a settlement, and there's lots of great shadow work. There's like a lot of battles within contained areas where they can really push what the Anthem engine can do in sort of more restricted areas before you go out in the second part of this demo and do the usual Assassin's Creed thing of traveling across the open world and carving your own path through the adventure. But so yeah, it was a strange preview in terms of gleaning what exactly we're getting out of the game on PC. So none the wiser on that. I think console will be very telling in terms of what we're whether GI will be included across the whole game or if it's just one area, the hideout area. But,
we'll it is weird. There's a weird omission, though, the hideout being it, and then the static solution apparently for everything else, which, I mean, based upon their description about how the settings are such a big part of the game, I wonder if there's going to be a very large visual discrepancy at that point, too, for turning it on, which could make it really worthwhile and great, but it would also leave all those people looking for a 60 FPS mode getting a much more visually inferior game. But oh my gosh, those are all things we're going to have to see in about a month's time when we do cover this on PC, console, and hopefully Mac. That'd be awesome to get some more Mac coverage, especially if something like this where we look at that spec sheet and we're like, what is this? But anyway, let's move on to the next part of the show. So Astro Bot has gotten a PlayStation 5 Pro patch. I haven't checked it out myself, but people at DF have. So who would like to take the reins on this one?
I am people, as it turns out in this instance, because I did take a detailed look at Astro Bot on PS5 Pro. So it was updated yesterday with a kind of innocuous patch. Like Rich sent it to the chat, and we didn't really think too much of it, because it says that we are pleased that owners of the PS5 Pro will be able to enjoy an improved version of Astro Bot featuring a constant best resolution while still running at 60 frames per second.
Constant best resolution.
Yes. So that's a little bit of an ambiguous wording. It sounds on the surface like kind of a DRS tweak, right? Or maybe native 4K or something, but presumably, nothing too crazy going on right there, right? And that's interesting because the game already used DRS on PS5. On PS5 Pro, it seems like it just increases the resolution range, right? Because you have more GPU power to bring to the table, maybe a 30% improvement in typical workloads there in Astro Bot, and so you see a higher resolution there. And so it's not totally clear exactly what that would mean for PS5 Pro in this instance. But I've done some comparisons in reality between the pre-patch and post-patch versions. Pre-patch is version 1.011 here, post-patch is 1.012. And the changes are actually quite interesting, to my surprise. It definitely looks quite different. It looks more detailed, sharper, but noisier and kind of fundamentally unstable. Usually there's a bit less aliasing, less jagged edges. Sometimes aliasing is worse on like specific models, specific areas of the screen. Usually it's a bit better. Now, viewers who have heard us talk about PS5 Pro before, may be getting a sense of what's going on here. And yes, I believe they are using PSSR, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, probably to go to 4K, which is, in my own reading of their comments here, maybe that's what that constant best resolution means here. Upscaling to a constant high resolution instead of using TAA from whatever resolution and not doing a temporal upscale where you see more variance in the final quality of the image. But PSSR doesn't do the most amazing job of achieving a super stable 4K image necessarily, so it's not all rainbows and path tracing there. Relative to the old solution, which was, just using the Pro's GPU, presumably, to increase the dynamic resolution, the results are a bit mixed, I would say, in these comparison shots, but better on the whole. In terms of stability, the old TA plus naive upscale versus PSSR, they have their strengths and weaknesses in motion and in idle here. The old TA actually tended to alias quite a bit sometimes, even in still shots, whereas with PSSR, it doesn't alias as much, and the aliasing tends to be a little bit milder. And the PSSR resolve is always at a pretty high level of sharpness, whereas the old solution changes a lot more depending on the content and the complexity of the scene. So in bigger scenes like I have here, it can look more aliased and softer. The other change between them is that screen space reflections, I think, look a little bit worse with PSSR. Maybe that comes down to PSSR doing a worse job with denoising, which is a common characteristic. But overall, I think I prefer the PSSR presentation just because less aliasing, little sharper, some noise, but you're not really going to notice that from typical viewing distances, I think, in this title with this content. It could be a different solution, but from my time analyzing PSSR, identifying PSSR across lots of titles, I'm fairly sure it's PSSR here. It'd be interesting to see if this maybe was using FSR instead. Maybe that would produce a different result. I'd be curious to see that. Maybe we'll get a PC version at some point and we'll know what that would look like. But in terms of resolution counts, I did a number of resolution counts, which are on screen right now. And I found that the Pro version now counts at a consistently lower res than it did before, which is, I think, what you would assume, given that PSSR consumes a decent chunk of GPU time, like 2 milliseconds for a 4K upscale, in that vicinity, so resolutions are lower by a fair margin. But again, image quality is where it matters. Performance is simple. It's a log 60. So the other visual change that I saw that's a little bit odd is that sometimes shadow maps at a distance looked a bit different. There could be a difference in filtering or resolution or something, but they looked a bit softer on PS5 Pro, but less obviously aliased relative to the prior patch now. They've also added, perhaps more importantly than all this technical minutia, they've added a new galaxy and a new challenge level. And I think they're going to be releasing a new challenge level for the next few weeks here. I think they have 5 challenge levels in total.
Oh, wow.
I tried it. It was pretty tough, I will say, but pretty fun, I would say. It's a challenge level, so you have to restart from the beginning every time you fail, which really makes it a little bit of a seat of your pants kind of experience relative to the other levels in the game, which have generous checkpointing and are a little bit easier to progress through. They do keep adding levels and content to this game, and it's a single one-time purchase thing, so I'm all for that here. It just seems like they're going to keep adding content to the game until they get sick or they're told to stop or they hit a certain mark in terms of bots or worlds or something. But I think it's super admirable that they keep pumping out content here. And I think this PS5 Pro upgrade, it's not earth-shaking, but it's reasonably worthwhile. It's an improvement.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, yeah, the slight negatives there, but also a lot of positive. And in general, if you don't like it, you can always technically revert to the previous patch, I guess, or just run the disc version, right? So
yeah, you could run the disc version.
There's something to be said about that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So that's all fine to me. But Oliver, thank you so much for the reporting there. I guess now it's time to move on to our next segment of the show. Okay, so now we're moving on to the Q&A segment of the show. If you're a first-time watcher here, this is where we take questions from our Patreon supporters or people on Discord and go through them, and we try and answer all those questions that we're either best informed to answer or the ones that we find the most entertaining. And this first question here comes from Anxiously Chrono Triggered, a name that I've seen many times before on the channel. Hello, gentlemen. PS5 Pro was released 3 months ago. What do you think about the hardware now when you have more experience with it? Cheers. We also have the question here from The Unreal Rich, a name I like. Hello, founders. Since the pre-release phase of PS5 Pro, I feel your impression on PSSR has shifted from a rather positive first impression on Sony titles showed initially to a more critical one following more and more lackluster implementations in PS5 Pro patches. What do you think are the reasons for this? Were the initial games the hand-picked exceptions whose engines were better suited to PSSR? Were they more closely helped by the PSSR engineers while third-party developers did not get the same assistance? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Keep up the great work, and here's to another 201 episodes. Now, Oliver, you're the PSSR man here. Take it away.
Yes. So I'll get to the first question second, but the second question is more interesting. So it's hard to say this for certain, but as far as we know, I think from what various developers have possibly said to us here, I don't think PSSR has a lot of configurability. I don't think there's a lot in PSSR necessarily that you can change out from the development side. It's kind of a fire and forget solution as far as we understand. But I do think the key thing here that really needs to be said is that the point of reference matters a lot. Like, what was the previous solution? So in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is our first point of contact with PSSR, and probably also the most compelling game that used PSSR on PS5 Pro, the previous solution was just a naive upscale. And a naive upscale from a pretty blurry base render there, even though it was running at an okay resolution on PS5, did not look very good. So any temporal upsampling that could eliminate some of that blur would probably be a big improvement. And indeed, the PS5 Pro games that are the most improved are games like FF7R, like T-Loop Part 1 and 2, like Stellar Blade, games that have bad AA or don't have temporal upsampling, and so benefit enormously from the introduction of PSSR. And I think those factors really come into play here. Like when we're saying PSSR isn't working well in the title, oftentimes it's not because of the quality in the abstract. Maybe the quality in the abstract is like okay, maybe it's not okay, but it's oftentimes we're looking at the PS5 version of the game, right? Or the pre-patch version on PS5 Pro. We're saying relative to what was there before, it's not doing a good job. Now, relative to no anti-aliasing, I'm sure it's doing a terrific job, right? But everything is compared to a reference here, right? We're going to compare it to the game using FSR often, and if it's not doing better than FSR, then we're going to say, oh, that's not good, right? That's kind of the way this goes. And so when you see diverging opinions in how PSSR operates, it's often that point of reference that's changing between different anti-aliasing solutions. In terms of my PS5 Pro overall impressions, I think it's really early days for the hardware. We've seen some really good efforts from certain games, like the aforementioned Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. We've seen some games that have pushed out ray tracing on the console. We're even seeing in the future with titles like Monster Hunter Wilds, this has been disclosed, they're pushing out ray tracing in that game. They're using different kinds of anti-aliasing solutions like PSSR, interesting things like that. We'll have to see how that goes. The early titles did not really impress me hugely. There were some bright spots in there. Your F1s, titles like that pushed out more ray tracing. In the end, some of the titles that did end up pushing out more ray tracing and did end up trying more ambitious things like Hogwarts Legacy didn't really come to a great conclusion there necessarily in terms of bringing together all those elements into a visually cohesive whole that actually looked better than the base console in a consistent manner. So far it's not been too great, but I think the potential of the console is still very much there. I think we've seen a lot of strong efforts on PS5 Pro in addition to some of the weaker ones. And I think that the promise of like a machine learning oriented console with a bigger GPU, with faster memory, I think it's still a compelling prospect. It's just not 100% there at the moment in terms of quality in like every game. And also PSSR just needs to get better. That's the other thing. PSSR has been getting better, but it needs to get a fair bit better before it's like up there with DLSS, CNN at least. That's kind of where I'd like it to be. So a couple thoughts there.
Tom?
Well, it's a two-parter. PS5 Pro, what's the opinion now that we've had more experience with it? I'll be honest. I think in the first 3 months since it released, it's been one of the most underwhelming hardware releases I've had to cover in many years, and I have to be blunt about that. It's been not a catastrophe. It's been interesting, intriguing sometimes, but as far as its saleability to people who especially for the price, it is a hard sell, and I think it's appealing to a very fractional part of the gaming community who just want the very best tech in the console space right now. And that'll kind of be overshadowed by, quickly with whatever PC does with so many ports coming from Sony of their own properties to PC. I think there's the argument for it is weakening a little bit with quite a few games kind of popping over. So I'm, from a Digital Foundry perspective, it's great to have, and it's fascinating, and there will be maybe a growing use case for it, depending on whether developers pivot most of their more resources to it for, a predominant amount of their, optimization on the game. But I just see base PS5 as being the one that they target. Yeah, so it's been interesting. I covered Dragon's Dogma 2, which was a good implementation. I think I recall some flickering with the GI, which was a downside. Then there was Black Ops 6, which had these white speckles, which is either fixed or will be fixed already. And then what was the other one? Silent Hill 2. That was it. That was
not good. That had problems.
No. Yeah. So those were my first few impressions of PSSR as a technology. And to be honest, that was just, three very different engines: RE Engine, Unreal Engine, and the IW's own tech in-house. So it does occur to me that there's a difference in the adoption of different engines, third-party technologies using PSSR as opposed to Sony's in-house studios and their own engines, which maybe got a bit more a priority within the first few months when it was the PS5 Pro released.
Yeah,
and I think those teething issues are going away quite quickly, and now we're past that hump. We're going to see a lot far better implementations of PSSR going forward. But it was not a great first impression. It by no measure, it was just a bad sort of first impression there. But that's where it is now anyway.
Yeah, I see this similar to both of you, but I also want to bring out an analogy of like when RTX 2000 came out touring, you couldn't really see a lot of the core benefits of that hardware right away, and it took a while. And I feel like PS5 Pro and what that means for the future of Sony is going to be similar to that, where the initial benefits, as much as that doesn't sell a product, so much for that, the initial benefits, we'll be seeing it more as time goes on. And I think especially we're going to be seeing a lot more Unreal Engine 5 titles, as we just saw today with that state of play. And all of those will benefit immensely from the PS4 Pro's GPU. Resolution, specifically, potential use of hardware ray tracing, another big benefit there. And I think those are all good things for PS5 Pro owners. PSSR is the one that I'm actually a little bit, now as time goes on, I'm a bit confused at what its future is. I think it will improve. We saw the same in PC space with XeSS and also DLSS since its 2.0 version. But with FSR 4 on the horizon, and whatever happens with PS6 and this Amethyst deal, if something like FSR 4 comes out and we immediately see that it is far superior to PSSR, I'm curious what PSSR's trajectory is then for, either for PS5 Pro or for PS6, or it just ends up being some sort of evolutionary dead end at some point, kind of like DLSS 1 was, right? Or kind of also like checkerboard rendering became in maybe not always positive way in the FSR 2 era, where it just disappeared. I'm just curious to see if that ends up happening with PSSR or if it starts its own evolutionary path next to FSR 4. And I don't know about that yet, but that's something that could potentially be happening in the future. But I think that's good enough for that question. Let's move on to the next. Now, this one comes here from Gimme More Frame Rate. And also we got another question after this. So, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's open world runs smoother than butter on a hot skillet. Yeah, sure. Seamlessly across a spectrum of different hardware. It seems to have gracefully dodged the dreaded pitfalls of compilation and traversal stutter. So could CryEngine be the unsung hero of open world games? Yeah, that would be nice. Or do you think that this was the engine's last great moment of glory? Same question, similar question here. Hello, gents. Is there a reason more developers don't use CryEngine? What are the advantages and disadvantages it provides compared to Unreal Engine? Wow, actually, those are two pretty different questions. I guess I kind of want to start with the second one. We talked about it earlier in the Crysis 4 segment here, and also the layoffs from Crytek, where I think CryEngine had a really hard sell on the Xbox 360 PS3 generation because of the reputation from Crysis 1. No one believed it could run on console, and it came there in a mitigated form eventually. But then Crysis 2 and Crysis 3 came out so late into the generation, it was like 2011 by that point already, that it was almost a next-gen engine at that point in time. And then a lot of things started to go wrong inside Crytek, and I think they were not positioning the engine well enough from an outward-facing way to really make it sell. Unreal had made so much headroom during the PS360 generation, in spite of problems with the engine, that it was kind of hard to win back that market. And so they really struggled, I think, for a long period of time. And it's a lot of just legacy things that actually don't have too much to do, I think, with technical things. I think it is a lot of marketing positioning there. That's my personal opinion. Now, regarding the second part of the question, I really want to take this because while I'm currently in the process of making, hopefully, a finished video about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's PC version, I've been struggling to get it out because I worked on Avowed midway through the week, which I took around like 2.5 days to get out to help John's video out there. And then I'm coming back to Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and I'm trying to focus the video on basically actually about the positive aspects of it, because I do think it is a rare, polished game on release on PC, and I actually want to make the video about something really positive. But at the same time, in the video, I kind of want to explain why it is running the way it is. And I think you can see that in the visual package that you're given. It is obviously, I would say, a pretty darn good looking game, but you can see the areas where not corners are cut, but where there's like legacy things that you would see more in a last generation game here, that you can kind of imagine why it doesn't have necessarily the same issues as other Unreal Engine based games. But that isn't this whole story too. They obviously did their own optimizations. I don't think an Unreal Engine game, even with the same level of fidelity, would be as stutter-free as Kingdom Come KCD2 is. And I think that is a success story. You can see the places where they are not as current gen as other titles, but you can also see the places where they are excelling above and beyond. So I kind of want to make this balanced video about that. Kind of looking at this in a good way. But I think, Tom, you're also looking at Kingdom Come 2 here as well. What are you thinking so far?
Yeah, I did the preview video on it, and it turned out to be a bit of a success overall on consoles, PS5, Xbox Series X, Series S, maybe to a lesser extent. I think that was capped 30, but what do you expect from Series S these days? Mm-hmm. It's a demanding game, and 30 felt right maybe for that. And there's a lot going on in terms of just the incredible density of the world design, the foliage, and the kind of physically based lighting, the light impact on that world. It's a quintessentially CryEngine look that I love. That dates back to the early days of, I think, Crysis 3, and everyone's gone back to the Rapture, and they've got this incredible... This engine somehow generates these incredibly picturesque, almost photoreal-looking landscapes, like forests, woodlands, parochial towns. It does that aesthetic incredibly well. So it's a match made in heaven in terms of the subject of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and the technology behind it. It's not without fault. In the build I played, which was, to be fair, captured 2 weeks before the video actually went live, so I had to insert like a bunch of caveats into the video. You probably noticed, just to say a little bit early. We'll see kind of how it goes. Not sure whether we're following up with the console video. It might be worth it. We're mulling it over because I'm working on a different project now, but kind of a follow-up to see how it's optimized post-release, because there's been a patch since then, obviously. There were a few areas in the preview build which had a few bugs, visual glitches, flickering textures, which, were so obvious it'd be incredible if the developer didn't spot them and didn't fix them. So, and there's a kind of some hitching, very occasional hitching and frame rate drops in some areas, very specific spots, which were so repeatable. I'd imagine that they're also addressed. So something we might return to. But I think it's, for the most part, it was really impressive, and it did flow seamlessly. Whether it's better than Unreal Engine in terms of that open world format, I'm not sure, because it's not. Unreal Engine's got its own set of issues with traversal stutter, but Epic have announced initiatives to kind of solve that, I believe. So yeah, the landscape might shift on that one.
This question comes here from, oh my goodness, this is a long one. This is from Ed. Maybe I'll have to summarize. We'll see. High DF exclamation point. I got to do the rich thing. With the 50 series graphics cards release, we saw very, in brackets, modest improvements on the rasterization side, and the main areas of improvement coming through AI enhancements. Do you see that continuing to the next generation of graphics cards? And if so, my question is, how do you see Nvidia gating these features? For example, the RTX 2000 series cards and onwards receive the transformer model updates, a first for older cards to still see improvements years after release. However, RTX 4000 series, RTX 40 series cards did not receive MFG. Do you think this was by choice from Nvidia, since, say, 4080 super users would have no real reason to upgrade to a 5080 otherwise if MFG was ported back in some way to the same way transformer models were? Do you see them continuing in this way, keeping AI side improvements that could be ported back exclusive to the new series? Well, I think Oliver's got something to say about this for sure, but I do as well too. I think some of the gating is artificial, and I think some of it is not. So I would say something like the transformer model is gated in returns for performance. The transformer model for super resolution specifically is pretty performant on RTX 2000 and 3000. But as soon as you get into the ray reconstruction territory there, and not a lot of games have ray reconstruction, but I think that's going to pick up over time, then I think it is much less viable on Turing and Ampere cards. And I don't know if you'd really be turning that on realistically in a lot of games if you're trying to hit 60, for example. And yeah, so I don't know about that. But something like MFG, you look like at an RTX 4090 and you look at an RTX 5080, and the 4090 is like outclassing it in all of these titles. And we run things like the transformer model of ray reconstruction on it, and it's like performing better than the 5080 still, while using, things like frame generation to single frame generation. So it's already stacking multiple machine learning effects there, right? Running the more expensive transformer model, and it's still running better than the 5080. I question in such a circumstance like that, why can't the 4080 and 4090 also get MFG then? Is it really that much more expensive for Ada Lovelace? I can't run it's a black box there. I can't run it on them, so I can't know, but my intuition there is really saying it probably shouldn't. And we kind of see that a little bit with what's happening on the driver's side with their smooth motion frame stuff, which is, basically like driver side frame generation that is going to be a lot less quality there. But originally, like the initial thing said like this is RTX 5000 only, and they were like, actually it's going to come to RTX 4000 later. And even then I'm like, why is it only on them? Like, people are running stuff like loss of scaling on like potato GPUs. I feel like that should be also back portable, maybe at a performance cost or something like that. So some of this I feel is like slightly artificial, and some of it isn't. There's a second part of this question that maybe Oliver, you can talk about. Essentially, like, is this the way we should see scaling in the future? Less rasterization gains and more focus on AI?
Yeah, I would. I mean, rasterization is, rasterization in terms of a term for the umbrella of like non-ray tracing, non-machine learning technologies that we see in computer games and computer graphics. It is running to a bit of a dead end because transistors, the kind of scaling you get from those techniques is just not showing up, and the process technologies are slowing way, way, way down. And there's just a lot of optimization space in ray tracing, in machine learning in particular, because oh man, there's just so much there's so much going on there every single day now, and a lot of that's going on in real-time rendering that's really, really exciting. But yeah, I would definitely expect like focusing on the rasterization performance of new GPUs, probably not that important, and I think that's certainly what I heard from Mark Cerny, and it's probably what you'll hear from every single hardware vendor now, at least as a competitive machine learning product, that's the more important venue to go down. But yeah, I mean, in my own personal opinion, I think for the most part, they probably won't gate features. But maybe they could for some things, but I think they won't for fundamental things like neural materials, mega geometry, things like this that are really fundamental to the way that a game is rendered and displayed. That needs to run across everything because Nvidia is pushing that, and other vendors will be pushing similar technologies perhaps. And they're going to want that to run across a wide range of cards because they want adoption in games, and that only benefits their newer cards, right? They need that broad adoption there. But for stuff like frame gen, or even like some forms of super resolution maybe, no, you don't really need that to be everywhere. You can just have it in some things because it's kind of like a value add on top of that base render. You don't need it to be there. In terms of MFG, is it gated? Maybe yes, maybe no. My own personal opinion, Nvidia is selling you a product with software as part of that product, and if they develop a technology, if they invest in that technology, and there is some basis to say that is going to run on our new GPUs only, even if technically maybe there is less of a basis for that to be the case. It's not the way that I'd like things to be necessarily, but I think that is probably the case, especially with now, in theory, frame generation should be running on, able to run on a lot of cards, maybe with unacceptable performance perhaps, but it should be able to run on a lot of Nvidia hardware, and it doesn't. Maybe that's for a more hardware-oriented reason or a more segmentation-oriented reason. But my kind of bright side look at this would be to say that, hopefully in the end, competition from other vendors will just make this question less relevant with MFG, because hopefully we'll see an MFG solution from AMD. Hopefully we'll see more third-party crazy MFG hacks like lossless scaling. Lossless scaling right now can do 20 times frame generation. You could have a game running at 8 FPS to 160 FPS, and I've seen people do that. And wow, that is crazy. That's a crazy world that we live in. And you know what? It's actually at an acceptable quality for some games running at higher frame rates. It is pretty cool. So, all that stuff is still going to be out there. MFG is still going to be available to you. That top tier of NVIDIA 4X MFG maybe won't be available to you. Maybe it will be available to you in the future. I think that's something they might consider, hopefully in the future. But for now, yeah, I think you can look at that in a number of different ways. I'm not going to tell people how to think necessarily.
Yeah, I just want to add one last thing to the rasterization part of this question. Should we be seeing more AI workloads, etc.? And that's like the parts where GPUs are actually advancing the most in the future in terms of raw performance. And I think, yes, just alongside, the fact that there's a lot of room for optimization there still. Oliver talked about it a few weeks back with the whole kind of explosion in the AI space. And I think also part of that is the scaling on rasterization is really poor on the top end. If you think about it, if you still have shadow maps, right? And if you just once again quadruple their size to from 2048 to 4096 in terms of 2D space, you're just getting a sharper approximation of the same effect, right? And that's not bringing much to the table anymore. We've already seen the declines in how useful that is on the hardware side. And it's also not very useful in terms of settings. For the first time, thanks to machine learning and ray tracing, which isn't a huge part of this question, we're actually seeing much more meaningful ultra settings in games where, like, you know, it wasn't super interesting when you got, like, you know, 2 times the samples on motion blur as your ultra setting or something like that. And that's what your PC version was. But now you can get like, oh, the entire lighting model's changed, or oh, reflections actually work like they do more like in real life now. That's a pretty intense ultra setting there that I'm much more fond of than what we had from like 2009 typically up until like 2018 or 2019. So I'm much more of a fan of that. And I think that's also a great reason why developers are going over to it, because they actually starting to see some good differentiation there. But that is enough, I think, for that question. Let's move on to the next. This next question here comes from Dudley the Gentleman. Hi, DF team. Does NVIDIA's Mega Geometry completely eliminate the need for proxy geometry to be used in ray traced and path trace scenes? If so, how do you see this technology affecting UE's hardware lumen and or megalights, assuming it is integrated into DXR? A separate but related question. Are there other areas related to BVH building and maintenance process that are clear problem areas to improve in the future? Well, I would say, based upon the first question here, NVIDIA's Mega Geometry doesn't completely eliminate the need for proxy geometry. You still have the fact that GPUs have a certain amount of triangles that they can realistically accelerate rays against, even if the BVH building is much more efficient. There's only a certain limit to them, and this has been increasing over time with each generation of hardware that is released on the Nvidia, on the AMD, and on the Intel side. They always say, like, we do 2x the amount of ray box and ray triangle intersections with this architecture versus our previous. I think that's been the case for all of the hardware vendors. So even if you had the BVH building process being much more efficient, you would still be limited in another aspect of the rendering, and things like, especially like RDNA 2 would have no hope of doing nanite level geometry at a really great frame rate, I'd imagine. I think there would be like a percentage scale slider that might be still required, say like 50%. And I think that is a big part of it. Now, I think for something like these stupid names, Mega Shadows, Mega Geometry isn't even that great of a name, Mega Shadows, I'm a little bit curious about that one too, because it would benefit really a lot from something like Mega Geometry, getting a more one-to-one look of the geometry there, because shadows, unlike reflections, can be kind of wonky and you won't notice because a lot of reflections in real life aren't perfect mirror ones, and you can fix up stuff in screen space. Same with diffuse lighting, but for stuff like shadows, it really needs to be one-to-one, and Mega Geometry is like the thing there, and that's exactly how mega shadows or mega lights work, or whatever they call it. And so getting that one-to-one representation is a big benefit. But at the same time, do I realistically see games coming out with that technology in the near future? Probably not, until there is a next version of DXR, in which case I don't think those titles would be using that as their base lighting model would be even targeting something like PS5. So this is really sounding like really far future stuff to me already. And one thing that you always still have to remember is right now this is NVIDIA. I think I said in my video, I think that this is going to come to DXR, but right now this is NVIDIA's proposal for DXR, and it's, curiously enough, it is like, I don't know, I almost expected something like this coming on the console side of things, but we didn't see it there. We saw Nvidia pushing this first, so I'm not sure what exactly that means for AMD and the next box that they produce, because AMD's hardware designs seem now a lot more orientated towards Sony and whatever Sony wants. So I don't know. I'm very curious to see how that shakes out. I guess the separate related question to this, I'm sorry I'm dominating this question, but this is
that's okay.
very
Go
much
for it.
so
Go
my
for it.
interest.
You're the guy for this.
I guess so. Related to BVH building and maintenance. Well, the thing is, at some point in the future, we're talking about triangles and ray tracing of triangles, even clusters of triangles with mega geometry. And there's other things that are not best represented by triangles. You've got particle effects, you've got certain types of things that take up volume. Those would be clouds, water, which typically are done with triangles still, but it's really rough approximation, let's be honest. Like all of these things, and even hair, are not maybe best represented by triangle approximations. And there you need a different primitive. And NVIDIA proposed a new type of primitive. They're calling them linear swept spheres. But as the blog post described them, and which was in a lot more detail than I got with even at CES, is that actually it's a pretty malleable primitive, and it can also just be a sphere. In which case, I don't actually know what the BVH looks like for a thing that is filled just with spheres. What exactly does that need to be? Does it need to be this 2-level system in the same way it was for triangles? I am actually not currently so versed in that, so I cannot completely say anything about it, but I imagine that this mixing of primitives will be another point of optimization in the future of ray tracing. We've only seen something from Nvidia so far, but maybe the other hardware vendors are also going to support this new primitive in the future, or other ones that are competing. And, there's going to be some mixing there. So I'm thinking maybe this is another area of optimization for the future. And that's really all I got to say about this question. Now, this one is a question from Kitty Raven, a name that I love, specifically directed at Oliver. It's referencing something last week, but I think Oliver can touch on this bit.
Yeah.
Maybe episode 200 last week can be an Oliver AI special. He didn't do that. I'd love to hear him talk more about the status quo in the field. Well, Oliver, I think you have some things to say about the status quo in the AI field.
I really thought I should answer this question this week, because there have been huge advances in the state of the art for LLMs in particular that I wanted to mention, and I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible because it's a little bit dense, but I just want to explain this and why I'm so excited and why this is so compelling. So there's this new functionality in ChatGPT called Deep Research. Google Gemini had a version of this, has had a version of this since last December, but the Gemini models, not nearly as good as the ChatGPT models, and their version of this is not nearly as compelling as the OpenAI version. So basically, it gives you a personalized brief on a subject faster than any human could by several orders of magnitude and in incredible detail. So 4.0 has been able to do pretty good web search since like September or October of last year, but it's like kind of mid-tier in intelligence. It's not really a reasoning model. It's going to make mistakes from time to time. It can't pull together all that many sources. It can't execute on a plan in a stepwise fashion over time to reason through a problem. It's just one shot. It's your question, a quick search, and then whatever emerges from the model is a waste from that point. There's no reasoning process on top of that. Whereas with this new deep reasoning model, it's the full GPT-03 in its first deployment anywhere. So that's the most powerful reasoning model on the planet that's been deployed in any capacity, brand new. And it basically takes the ChatGPT search functionality, combines it with this reasoning model, and then it lets it roll for 5 to 30 minutes with this deep research project, and it can produce some incredible results. So for instance, I wrote my notes for this direct, and then I put them into deep research for fact checking and verification. And if there's anything I missed, it took 13 minutes and it came back with 13,000 words of meticulously detailed fact checking that would have taken a researcher, I'm sure, like a day. It's crazy. I also used it to compile all the information about every state of play game here, just to give me some background information. Again, not super relevant necessarily to the conversation. I wanted to see what it could do. And it compiled 18,000 words of very dense and rich information in 17 minutes. So it's like having a researcher who has an internet connection, and you speed them up by 100 times and you make them 1/400th of the cost. It's crazy. Now, for our work, this has, questionable applicability, at least to a lot of the work that I do, because we're so focused on the visual output of games, often unreleased games. So that really doesn't do anything for that. This is all text. This is all information that's on the internet, basically. But I do think when it is useful, it could possibly be quite useful. If you can find something to apply it to, it feels like a superpower. It is so fast. It is like the craziest thing I've ever seen in AI. The only downside is that its use is very limited. So right now, I upgraded to the Pro ChatGPT plan so I could use it, which is $200 a month USD. Not so.
Oh my God!
Not so good. And you only get 100 uses per month. Which sounds like a lot, but it's really low relative to any other model where you might have 100 uses every few hours or something. It's really compute intensive. But they do say they're bringing it to the Plus plan at about 10 messages per month, which should be reasonable to just try it out, or even on the free plan, 2 messages per month. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
But it can easily provide like hundreds of dollars of value per search. I could totally see that for people with the right applications here in a very wide variety of fields. It's really good. And of course, from here, it's only going to get cheaper, faster. The pace of AI progress is so quick. We're talking about 10 times, 100 times reductions in cost every single year here. Like the pace is insane. So this stuff is going to be really quite cheap very quickly. And it's already like not expensive relative to the cost of hiring someone.
A researcher.
Obviously a researcher.
Yeah.
So now, of course, like a lot of AI technologies that are very good, this has potentially enormous potential for really, really negative consequences in terms of distribution in the kinds of economies we live in. But it's a stunning accomplishment. Easily the most impressive application of AI I've ever seen. Very, very cool. Almost like super intelligent in the speed and depth and breadth of information it can get out of you. And I've got lots of examples on screen right here. It's really quite incredible. And it's very, very accurate, I find. Rarely makes mistakes. It does make mistakes, rarely makes mistakes. And again, that will get better. I also wanted to mention Pika Editions, which is cool, a little off left field here, but it's a cool little AI video application that, again, has come out in the past week. I've seen lots of AI video models. This is quite different, though, in it is not replacing a live action production, it's adding to a live action production. So you get your live action plate and you add an AI CGI character to it, essentially, or element to it. And generally it integrates really well into your video. The lighting is consistent. It can interact plausibly with elements in the scene. Animation is okay. Masking is pretty good against like foreground elements. And it's really cool. It's not really at a grade that would work for like professional video, but it's good for social media video. And its flexibility and integration with real world content, I think is really cool. And, you know, of course, these AI video applications, I'm always thinking, could this be suitable for real time? Now, of course, these are running on server GPUs over minutes, so probably not. But, you know, a few, you know, order of magnitude improvements here, there, everywhere over time. Maybe you could see something like this running on for a real-time application at some point. Again, a bit of a distant dream at this point, but certainly the quality is getting there. If the quality is getting there, then it's a question of speed. You know, 6 months ago, I would say the quality wasn't really getting there. Now it's getting there in a lot of respects. So that's really cool. So just 2 updates on AI stuff. One really apocalyptic, earth-shaking, crazy thing that is like pretty nuts to experience and to use. And I'd certainly advise anyone who has a fair chunk of change wants to give it a shot because it could be totally life-changing for some people in some fields, totally life-changing in both good and bad ways.
Yeah, I could imagine. Yeah.
But and the Pika Editions thing, I think, is just a really cool application of AI video that I had not seen before. So just 2 updates on the state of the art in AI, but I'll go back to my corner now. I'm done with my little rant here.
It's a good corner.
But that's all I had to say.
Yeah, I actually have a question about the research model. Also, thank you for that report on all that stuff. It's good to know. The research model, does it provide you with footnotes and references so that you can call back to exactly where the source was? That this like collation of that's really useful.
It has inline citations, so right next to and when you click the citation, it doesn't just take you back to the web page, it takes you back to a highlighted part of the web page where it drew its information from. So you can super easily check every single piece of information if you want to check, or you could have an LLM double check it for you. You could just throw this through recursively, recycle it in and out, wash it through an LLM if you wanted to. But you can check everything yourself. It's really like extremely the one universal aspect of all these AI tools is they're almost always super user-friendly, and OpenAI has just integrated this in the most user-friendly way imaginable. It's really, really something special, and it can provide so much insight into different issues. It can pull from so many different sources, do research that would take such a long time to do. I mean, it's outrageous, but yeah, not too applicable to like a typical video that I do, but perhaps sometimes as some use.
It's also interesting to just think about it, because like I understand why this could be extremely negative to the profitability and even livelihoods of a whole ton of people. But at the same time, the web right now is so hostile to getting information. It is incredibly hostile. Like going to a website, I loaded up a German website just the other day on my phone, and it was one that I'd used like a couple of years ago, and I came back to it now, and the scrolling experience on my phone was absurd. Like half page ad, bottom page ad, things on the side bracketing it, then hitting like some buttons to get stuff to go away, and I was still scrolling through nonsense at that point, and it was just impossible. And this was one page, and even getting to that page in the first place was a problem. And having the whole idea of the internet, of having the world of information at your fingertips, has become long obfuscated in search engines and also on the web pages themselves, that this actually does seem pretty revolutionary in that aspect, Oliver. I'm not going to lie.
I mean, to me, like, Google is borderline unusable at times. And
it's
going
crap.
through websites with
crap.
a ton of different ads and content tracking and slowness.
And the cookies as well.
Cookies,
all the
stuff.
All the cookies.
It's frustrating. And this is basically a way to get a perfectly curated version of the internet to you in, 5 to 30 minutes of this model running very, very quickly on some GB200 somewhere in Arizona or whatever. It's a very easy way to get you the internet in exactly the format you want it to. Now, again, that has negative implications for some things, but like even still, I'm reading through these reports, I'm clicking the links, I'm going through, I'm visiting the sites as well. I'm doing the whole thing. I'm really excited to see everything. So, it's an incredible way to just get the internet to you. And initially when I started using it, I'm like, I'm going to put $200 down just so I can experiment with it. But now I'm using it for a number of different queries and finding value in all kinds of ways that I would have never expected, because this tool is so powerful. It's a great replacement for Google search. I mean, it's the world's most comprehensive Google search compiled by a researcher who works 100 times quicker than any human. I mean, it's crazy. But anyways, I'm done with my little spiel.
I think in terms of like its use for games, it's exactly as you say. Like, we have an initiative sometimes on the information about a game before it reaches the internet, and we'll get like preview builds. So the information is almost like exclusive to us. So in that sense, it's like that there's limited application for that.
It's also visual information. It's also experiential, right? These are things that LMs can't really touch at the moment. So it's not really applicable to our work necessarily. It's applicable to a lot of people's work in possibly negative ways, which is why I want to be sensitive to that. But it's also an incredible development in technology that is just like outrageously impressive. But that's all.
That was an awesome topic. I think we should do this more like on a semi-weekly basis, Oliver, because that was a lot of information and things that I don't know about. And I would only read possibly bad headlines about that I wouldn't understand because I don't have nearly enough interest as you do. I'm
happy to do so.
But this is good.
Whenever there's something exciting. Now, like I said, for me personally, over the past 3 years, there have been a few exciting things, but over the past 3 months, there have been like 4 or 5 exciting things. So it's just getting faster. But this has been super exciting. And if there is stuff that's exciting in the future, perhaps I can tell our audience a little bit about it and why it's so compelling.
Okay, well, thank you, Oliver. Now let's move on to the final question here. Okay, final question here. I'm going to do it from some guy person, and we all can say something about this, definitely. With all the talk about how PC gaming is getting too expensive, in quotations there, how much do you really need to spend on a GPU to have a good experience? Do you really need to spend $1,000 to $2,000 plus on a GPU to feel validated and loved? If I buy a $500 GPU, will people kick dirt in my face? If I spend a measly $300 on a GPU, will my family abandon me with how little I've spent on it? Help DF! Exclamation point, as Rich would say. Well, I mean, I have a lot to say here, but I would love to hear what you have to say, Tom.
Well, I suppose if you're gunning for a $500 GPU, you're kind of going towards the console budget as well. Was it $450, about that region? I'm just checking the prices now for, you've got the 4070 in pounds, right. I suppose. You've got 520 pounds on Amazon right now. That's okay. That will last you out for a good while. Yeah, there's a 7800 XT out there, 500 as well, which I suppose is about equivocal to dollars at this point, given the current exchange rates. So yeah, I think you could get good mileage. I mean, 4 years, 5 years till the end of the generation, and I suppose with the rise in sort of DLSS or machine learning technologies, that will extend it in theory if they become smarter about the way they work around. If you want to add ray tracing to the formula, as your Cyberpunks or in a future game, you're going to have a more effective way to hit that. So there's more than ever, I'd say, we're not looking at fixed points in terms of the hardware. There's a more dynamic range of possibilities going into the future, based more on the driver, which should be very interesting to see.
That's actually a good point. I would say things are getting much more expensive on the higher end side of things. The most expensive GPU you can buy now is a lot more expensive than the GPU. I mean, adjusted for inflation, obviously there's differences there, but I'd still say an RTX 5090 is more expensive than an 8800 Ultra in 2007. Yeah, but back then people were buying SLIs of those things. Like, don't forget that too.
I remember.
SLI was pretty cool back then. But so I'd say the higher end is getting much more expensive, and the mid range is also what is considered the mid range in the full stack is also getting more expensive on a lot of ways. But there's a larger modability in graphics now than there was in the past, thanks to technologies that are multiplicative. I think DLSS is a pretty big game changer, where something like an RTX 2070 Super, for example, back in 2018 is now much more viable GPU now, thanks to something like DLSS. Whereas in years past, a $500 GPU in 6 to 7 years would be just like a useless hunk of junk. For the most part, like you couldn't use it in almost any title and get any sort of really great, reasonable, semi-high resolution experience. So I think that is a good multiplicative factor there. And also, I'll always contend that people do over-exaggerate the price of PC gaming in general, because PC gaming is not monolithic. It is not RTX 5090s only in 9800 X3Ds. It is also the new Intel cards, right? It is also APUs. It is also, a lot cheaper experiences there that still have a lot of value. And the legacy of PC gaming is such that you get access to tens of thousands of titles that will run still at 1080p 60 on extremely cheap hardware, right? So, and not every game's a AAA game, so you don't need that anyway. So I think the diversity in the PC experience is still one of its core strengths, and that is still surprisingly cheap, actually, if you really do want to get a cheaper machine. I don't know, Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, for me, from my own perspective, I would say that a GPU at about $500, $600 can give you a really good experience in AAA, especially if you're looking at something like a 4070 or a 5070, because those GPUs can push out advanced ray tracing, path tracing even. Sometimes at lower resolutions, you might need to notch down texture quality or two. It might not work in all games, but you can often get a lot of that PC feature set in that class of GPU at, say, 1440p with upscaling potentially. At $300, I just think you're getting something more compromised, more console level. And to me, the point of a desktop PC is really to exceed consoles by a good margin. Otherwise, personally, based on my own preferences for ease of navigation and use and simplicity, I'd rather just have a console. So at $500, that's the point at which PC software and hardware starts lighting up my brain a little bit with possibilities. But of course, I think you're in better hands still at $750, at $1,000, or at $1,600 or $2,000 with the 4090, 5090. 4090 and 5090 are still colossally impressive GPUs, and the 16 gigabyte GPUs that you'll see at about $1,000 or somewhat less there are really compelling. Again, in the Nvidia side of the range, with Intel, it's more low-end stuff. With AMD, it does trend a little lower end, but you aren't necessarily always getting good performance in path tracing titles, or at least not nearly as good of performance as you would get with a comparably expensive Nvidia GPU. And of course, you're not getting ray reconstruction. You're not getting a lot of the technologies that really make that work. So yeah, that's just my opinion, but I'm a bit of a console partisan in some respects. I do play a lot on PC nowadays. Surprisingly, I do play a lot on PC, especially recreationally, even though I'm mostly covering consoles for work. But for me personally, the point of a PC is either give me an experience I could never have on console in terms of portability, like a Steam Deck, or give me an experience I could never have on console in terms of raw power, like a 5090 PC, say.
Yeah.
And that's really what I'm
100%.
interested in. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's also the thing. We all just came up this question with like different answers based on our preferences, and I think that's also another thing that is just completely devoid usually on the discussion of talking about like, is this GPU the same as the PS5 Pro? Is that with PC you have the ability to work your own niche interests into the platform and then get something out of it. So we all came out with this with different niche interests, and we came up with different answers to the exact same question. That's pretty cool. But I think that is the end of the show. That was a long one. But
how have we done it? Wow.
We somehow did it. I somehow managed to replace Rich for 1 week, and thank God it's only 1 week. Thank you, gentlemen. Whatever. I mean, I'm fading. But either way, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me of this episode 201 DF Direct. Okay, so if you did like DF Direct 201, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell in the corner, go to Patreon, support us out. Don't forget to go to our merchandise store to look at all the cool stuff we got going on there to support us. And as always, we'll see you next week.